no preference in the matter. She held her green skirts up so the silk did not trail in the blood-soaked mud or the offal that littered the ground, yet she stepped over legs into round heads as casually as did the maidens. She also had woven a parasol against the rain, as had Olivia, although not until she saw the green do so. Rand had tried to make the sisters sworn to him teach the Shang woman more about the power, but to their minds, that had nothing to do with their oaths of fealty. She was safe to herself and seemed safe to others, and they were content to leave matters as they were. Nynaeve had refused too, because of his viewing. Gadswain had coolly informed him that she was not in the business of instructing wilders. This truly would be a charnel house then, Min said. Her walk had a fetching sway to it, though she was plainly trying not to think of what lay underfoot, while avoiding planting a heeled blue boot on any of it at the same time. And that made her stumble now and again. She was getting wet, too, her ringlets beginning to cling to her head, though the blonde carried no hint of vexation. Only anger, that seemed directed at Logain from the sharp stare she was giving him. Where would the servants go, and the people who worked the fields and stables and barns? How would they live? There won't be another attack, Rand said. Not until whoever sent this one learns it failed. And maybe not then. This is all they sent. The Myrddraal wouldn't have attacked piecemeal. Logain grunted, but he could not argue with that. Rand looked back toward the manor house. In some places, dead Trollocs lay right at the foundations. None had made it inside, but Logain was right, he thought, surveying the carnage. It had been a close-run thing. Minus the Ashaman and the Aes Sedai Logain had brought, the end might well have been different. A very close-run thing. And if there was another attack later, plainly someone knew Ishamael's trick, or that blue-eyed man in his head really could locate him. Another attack would be larger, that or come from some unexpected direction. Perhaps he should let Logain bring a few more Ashaman.
Hey, Fire, how you doing?
Them.
Luthern wept.
Too late now, too late.
The source is clean now, fool, Rand thought.
Right?
Yes, Theron replied. But are they?
My speaker's
Am I?
charged. My
Rand
dab
had
brake's
wondered that about
charged.
himself. Half of the double wound in his side had come
You
from
shouldn't have no
Ishamael,
problems
the
today.
other half from Cotton Thane's dagger that carried the tank to Shada Luggeth. They often throbbed, and when they did, they seemed alive. The circle of maidens parted slightly to let through a white-haired serving man with a long, sharp nose who looked even frailer than Ethan. He was trying to shelter beneath a two-tiered seafolk parasol missing half its fringe, of all things, but the aged blue silk had several ragged holes worn in it, so small rivulets fell on his yellow coat and one on his head. His thinning hair clung to his skull and dripped. He seemed wetter than if he had gone without. Doubtless one of Elgaren's forebears had obtained the thing somehow as a memento, but the obtaining must have been a story in itself. Rand
Hey,
wondered the
Fire.
seafolk gave up the clan wave mistress's parasol lightly.
My Lord Dragon,
The old man said with a bow that spilled more water down his back.
Varen Sedai instructed me to give this to you straight away.
From beneath his coat, he produced a paper.
Roll
folded
one up
in
and
sequins. Rand hastily stuffed it into a pocket of his own coat against
we'll
the
do a
rain.
dab.
Ink ran easily. Thank you, but it could have waited till I returned to the house. Best you get back inside before you're soaked through completely.
She did say straight away, my Lord Dragon.
The fellow sounded offended.
She is Aes Sedai.
At Rand's nod, he bowed again and started slowly back toward the manor house, his back stiff with pride, the parasol showering him with streams of water. She was Aes Sedai. Everyone hopped for Aes Sedai, even in Tyr, where they were not much liked. What did Varen have to say that she needed to put in a letter? Thumbing the seal, Rand walked on. His destination was one of the barns, its thatched roof partially blackened. This was the barn the Trollocs had gotten into. A burly fellow, in a rough brown coat and muddy boots, leaning against a jamb in the open doors, straightened and for some reason
Yeah, it's
hastily looked
gotta get a
inside over
couple
his
rolled
shoulder
up.
as Rand approached, the maidens spreading out to surround the barn. He stopped dead in the doorway, Min and the others halting beside him. Logan groaned an oath. A pair of lanterns hanging from uprights that supported the loft gave a dim light, enough to see that every single surface was thick with crawling flies, even the straw-covered dirt floor. As many more buzzed around in the air, it seemed. Where did they come from? Rand asked. Algarn might not be wealthy, yet his barns and stables were kept as clean as such places could be. The burly man gave a guilty start. He was younger than most of the servants in the house, but his head was bald halfway back, and creases bracketed his wide mouth, fanned out from his eyes. Don't know, my lord, he muttered, knuckling his forehead with a grimy hand. He focused on Rand so hard that it was plain he did not want to look into the barn. I stepped to the door for a breath of fresh, and when I turned around, they was all over everything. I thought maybe these dead flies. Rand shook his head in disgust. These flies were all too alive. Not every Saldean defending this barn had died, but all of the Saldean dead had been gathered here. Saldeans disliked burials in rain. None of them could say why, but you just did not bury people while it was raining. 19 men lay in a neat row on the floor, as neat as it could be when some were missing limbs or had their heads split open. But they had been laid out carefully by their friends and companions, their faces washed, their eyes closed. They were why he had come here, not to say goodbye or anything sentimental. He had not known any of these men more than to recognize a face here and there. He had come to remind himself that even what seemed a complete victory had its cost in blood. Still, they deserved better than to be crawling with flies. I need no reminders, Bruce Theron growled. I'm not you, Rand thought. I have to harden myself. Logan, get rid of these bloody things, he said aloud. You're harder than I ever was, Bruce Theron said. Suddenly he giggled. If you're not me, then who are you? Now I'm a flaming fly whisk, Logan muttered. Rand rounded on him angrily, but Olivia spoke in that slurred drawl before he could get a word out. Let me try, my lord, she asked in a manner of speaking, but like an Aes Sedai, she did not wait for permission. His skin tingled with goosebumps as she embraced Sayadar and channeled. Flies always took shelter from even the lightest rain because one raindrop was enough to put a fly in the ground, easy prey until its wings dried off. Yet suddenly the doorway was billowing with buzzing flies as if the rain were far preferable to the barn. The air seemed solid with them. Rand batted flies away from his face, and Min covered her face with her hands, the bond heavy with distaste, but they were interested only in flight. In moments, they were all gone. The balding man, staring at Olivia with his mouth hanging open, suddenly coughed and spat out 2 flies onto his hand. Cadswain gave him a look that snapped his mouth shut and sent his rough knuckle flying to his forehead. Just a look, yet she was who she was. So you watch, she said to Olivia. Her dark eyes were fixed on the Shang-Chen woman's face, but Olivia did not start or stammer. She was much less impressed by Aes Sedai than most people. And remember what I see. I must learn somehow if I am to help the Lord Dragon. I have learned more than you are aware of, but Min made a sound in her throat, very nearly a growl, and the bond swelled with anger, but the yellow-haired woman ignored her. You are not angry with me? She asked Rand, her voice anxious. I'm not angry. Learn as much as you can. You're doing very well. She blushed and dropped her eyes like a girl startled by an unexpected compliment. Fine lines decorated the corners of her eyes, but sometimes it was hard to remember that she was 100 years older than any living Aes Sedai, rather than half a dozen years younger than himself. He had to find someone to teach her more. Randall Thor, Min said angrily, folding her arms beneath her breasts. You are not going to let that woman. Your viewings are never wrong, he broke in. What you see always happens. You've tried to change things and it never worked. You told me so yourself, Min. What makes you think this time can be different? Because it has to be different, she told him fiercely. She leaned toward him as though ready to launch herself at him. Because I want it to be different. Because it will be different. Anyway, I don't know about everything I've seen. People move on. I was wrong about Moraine. I saw all sorts of things in her future, and she's dead. Maybe some of the other things I saw never came true either.
It must not be different this time,
Luce Theron panted.
you promised.
A faint scowl appeared on Loghain's face, and he shook his head slightly. He could not like hearing Min question her ability. Rand almost regretted telling him about her viewing of him, though it seemed harmless encouragement at the time. The man had actually asked Aes Sedai to confirm Min's ability, though he had been wise enough to try to keep his doubting from Rand. I cannot see what makes this young woman so vehement for you, boy, Catswain mused. She pursed her lips in thought, then shook her head, ornaments swaying. Oh, you're pretty enough, I suppose, but I just cannot see it. To avoid another argument with Min, she did not call them that, she called them talking, but he knew the difference. Rand took out Baron's letter and broke the blob of yellow sealing wax impressed with the head of a great serpent ring. The Brown sisters' spidery hand covered most of the page, a few letters blotted where raindrops had soaked the paper. He walked closer to the nearest lantern. It gave off a faint stink of spoiled oil. As I said, I have done what I can do here. I believe that I can fulfill my oath to you better elsewhere, so I have taken Tomas and going to be about it. There are many ways to serve you, after all, and many needs. I am convinced that you can trust Cadswain, and you certainly should heed her advice. But be wary of other sisters, including those who have sworn fealty to you. Such an oath means nothing to a black sister, and even those who walk in the light may interpret it in ways you would disapprove of. You already know that few see that oath as invoking absolute obedience in all things. Some may find other holes. So whether or not you follow Cadswain's advice, and I repeat that you should, follow mine. Be very wary. It was signed simply Varen. He grunted sourly. Few thought the oath meant absolute obedience. It was more like none. They obeyed usually, yet the letter was not always the spirit. Take Varen herself. She warned him against the others doing things he might disapprove of, but she had not said where she was going or what she intended to do there. Was she afraid he might not approve? Maybe it was just Aes Sedai
There's one
concealed
done.
it. Sisters
do
kept
one more.
secrets as naturally as they breathed. When he held out the letter to Cadswain, her left eyebrow twitched slightly. She must have been truly startled to show so much, but she took the letter and held it where the lantern's light illuminated it. A woman of many masks, she said finally, handing the page back. But she gives good advice here. What did she mean about masks? He was about to ask her when Royal and Elder Hammond suddenly appeared in the doorway, each carrying a long-handled axe with an ornately decorated head on his shoulder. The white-haired Ogier's tufted ears were laid back, his face grim, and Royal's ears were flickering. With excitement, Rand guessed. It could be difficult to tell.
I trust we are not interrupting,
Elder Hammond said, his ears rising as he looked sadly at the line of bodies. You are not, Rand told him, sticking the letter back in his pocket. I wish I could come to your wedding, Royal, but...
Oh, that's done, Rand,
Royal said. He must be excited. It was unlike him to interrupt.
My mother insisted. There won't even be time for much of a wedding feast, maybe none. What with the stomp and me having to...
The older Ogier laid a hand on his arm.
What?
Royal said, looking at him.
Oh, yes, of course. Well...
He scrubbed under his broad nose with a finger the size of a fat sausage. Something he was not supposed to be told? Even Ogier had secrets, it seemed. Rand fingered the letter in his pocket. But then so did everyone else.
I promise you this, Rand,
Boyle said.
whatever happens, I will be there with you at Tormengarten. Whatever happens. My boy,
Elder Hammond murmured.
I don't think you should.
He trailed off, shaking his head and rumbling under his breath like a distant earthquake. Rand crossed the straw in 3 strides and offered his right hand. Smiling widely, and with an Ogier that meant very wide, Boyle took it in a hand that enveloped his. This close, Rand had to crane his neck to look up at his friend's face. Thank you, Loyal. I can't tell you how much hearing that means to me. But I'll need you before then.
You need me?
Loyal, I've sealed the way gates I know in Caemlyn and Kyrian, Ilion and Tyr, and I put a very nasty trap on the one that was cut open near Faldara. But I couldn't find the one near Fawn Matting. Even when I know there's a way gate actually in a city, I can't find it by myself. And then there are all those cities that don't exist anymore. I need you to find the rest for me, Loyal, or Trollocs will be able to flood into every country at once. And no one will know they're coming until they're in the heart of Andor or Kyrian. Boyle's smile vanished. His ears trembled and his eyebrows drew down till the ends lay on his cheeks.
I can't, Rand,
He said mournfully.
I must leave first thing tomorrow morning, and I don't know when I'll be able to come outside again.
I know you've been out of the steading a long time, Loyal. Rand tried to make his voice gentle, but it came out hard. Gentleness seemed a fading memory. I'll speak to your mother. I'll convince her to let you leave after you've had a little rest.
He needs more than a little rest.
Elder Hammond planted the butt of his axe haft on the floor, gripping the axe with both hands, and directed a stern look at Rand. Ogier were peaceful people, yet he looked anything but.
He has been outside more than 5 years. Far too long. He needs weeks of rest in a steading at the least. Months would be better. My mother doesn't make those decisions anymore, Rand. The truth to tell, I think she's still surprised to realize it. Aerith does. My wife.
His booming voice put so much pride into that word that he seemed ready to burst with it. His chest certainly swelled, and his smile split his face in two. And I haven't even congratulated you, Rand said, clapping him on the shoulder. His attempt at haughtiness sounded false in his own ears, but it was the best he could manage. If you need months, then months you shall have. But I still need an Ogier to find those way gates. In the morning I'll take you all to Steading Shangtai myself. Maybe I can convince someone there to do the job. Elder Hammond shifted his frown to his hands on the axe haft, and began muttering again, too softly to make out words, like a bumblebee the size of a huge mastiff, buzzing in an immense jar in the next room. He seemed to be arguing with himself.
That might take time,
Boyle said doubtfully.
You know we don't like to make hasty decisions. I'm not certain they will even let a human into the steading because of the storm. Rand, if I can't come back before the last battle, you will answer my questions about what happened while I was in the steading, won't you? I mean, without making me drag everything out of you.
If I can, I will, Rand told him. If you can, Luce there snarled. You agreed we could finally die at Tormengarten. You agreed, madman. You'll answer your questions to your heart's delight, Loyal, Nin said firmly, if I have to stand over him the whole while. Anger suffused the bond. She really did seem to know what he was thinking. Elder Hammond cleared his throat.
It seems to me that I myself am more accustomed to outside than almost anyone except the stonemasons. Yes. In fact, I think I am likely to be the best candidate for your task.
Faugh, Catswain said. It seems you infect even Ogier, boy. Her tone was stern, but her face was all Aes Sedai composure, unreadable, hiding whatever was passing behind those dark eyes. Loyal's ears went rigid with shock, and he almost dropped his axe, fumbling to catch it.
You? But the stomp, Elder Hammond, the great stomp. I believe I can safely leave that in your hands, my boy. Your words were simple yet eloquent. My advice is don't try for beauty. Keep the simple eloquence, and you may surprise quite a few, including your mother.
It seemed impossible that Loyal's ears could grow any stiffer, but they did. His mouth moved, but no words came out. So he was to speak to the stump. What was so secret about that? My Lord Dragon, Lord Davram has returned. It was Elsa Penfeld who escorted Bashir into the barn. She was a handsome woman in a dark green riding dress. Her brown eyes seemed to grow feverish when they found Rand. She, at least, was one he did not have to worry about. Elsa was fanatical in her devotion. Thank you, Elsa, he said. Best you return to help with the cleanup. There's a long way to go yet. Her mouth tightened slightly, and her gaze took in everyone from Cadswain to the Ogier with an air of jealousy before she offered a curtsy and left. Yes, fanatical was the word. Bashir was a short, slender man in the gold-worked gray coat with the ivory baton of the Marshal General of Saldaea, tipped with a golden wolf's head, tucked behind his belt opposite his sword. His baggy trousers were tucked into turned-down boots that had been waxed till they shone despite a light splattering of mud. His recent work had required as much formality and dignity as he could supply, and he could supply a great deal. Even the Sean-Chan must have heard his reputation by now. Gray streaked his black hair and the thick mustaches that curled around his mouth like down-turned horns. Dark-tilted eyes sad, he walked right past Rand with the rolling gait of a man more accustomed to a saddle than his own feet. Walked slowly along the line of dead men, staring intently at each face. Impatient as Rand was, he gave him his time to mourn. I've never seen anything like what's outside, Bashir said quietly as he walked. A big raid out of Blight is 1,000 Trollocs. Most are only a few hundred. Cocoon, you never did guard your left the way you should. Even then, you need to outnumber them 3 or 4 times to be assured you won't go into their cookpots. But there, I think I saw a foreshadowing of Tamangaiden. A small part of Tamangaiden. Let's hope it really is the last battle. If we live through that, I don't think we'll ever want to see another. We will, though. There's always another battle. I suppose that will be the case until the whole world turns tinker. At the end of the row, he stopped in front of a man whose face was split almost down to his luxuriant black beard. Ozcon here had a bright future ahead of him, but you could say the same of a lot of dead men. Sighing heavily, he turned to face Rand. The Daughter of the Nine Moons will meet you in 3 days at a manor house in northern Altara, near the border of Andor. He touched the breast of his coat. I have a map. She's already near there somewhere, but they say it isn't in lands they control. When it comes to secrecy, these Sean-Chan make Aes Sedai look as open as village girls. Cadswain snorted. Do you suspect a trap? Logain eased his sword in its scabbard, perhaps unconsciously. Bashir made a dismissive gesture, but he eased his sword too. I always suspect a trap. It isn't that. The High Lady Surath still didn't want me or Manfor to talk to anyone but her. Not anyone. Our servants were mutes, just as when we went to Abu Dar with Loyal.
Mine had had her tongue cut out.
Loyal said in tones of disgust, his ears tilting back. His knuckles paled on the haft of his axe. Hammond made a shocked sound, his ears going stiff as fence posts. Altara just crowned a new king, Bashir went on. But everybody in the terrace and palace seemed to be walking on eggshells and looking over their shoulders, Sean Chan and Altarn alike. Even Sura looked as though she felt a sword hovering above her neck. Maybe they're frightened of Tom and Geiger, Rand said, or the Dragon Reborn. I'll have to be careful. Frightened people do stupid things. What are the arrangements, Bashir? The Saldaean pulled the map from inside his coat and walked back to Rand, unfolding it. They're very precise. She will bring 6 Suldam and Damani, but no other attendants. Olivia made a noise like an angry cat, and he blinked before going on, no doubt uncertain of a freed Damani, to say the least. You can bring 5 people who can channel. She'll assume any man with you can, but you can bring a woman who can't to make the honors even. Min was suddenly at Rand's side, wrapping her arm around his. No, he said firmly. He was not about to take her into a possible trap. We'll talk about it, she murmured, the bond filling with stubborn resolve. The most dire words a woman can say short of "I'm going to kill you," Rand thought. Suddenly he felt a chill. Had it been him? Or Luz Theron? The madman chuckled softly in the back of his head. No matter. In 3 days, one difficulty would be resolved. One way or another. What else, Bashir?
Lifting the damp cloth that lay across her eyes, carefully so she did not catch the bracelet and rings Angreal in her hair, she wore that and her jeweled Turangreal every waking moment now. Nynaeve sat up on the edge of her bed. With men needing healing from dreadful wounds, some missing a hand or an arm, it had seemed petty to ask healing for a headache, but the willow bark seemed to have worked as well, only more slowly. One of her rings, set with a pale green stone that now appeared to glow with a faint internal light, seemed to vibrate continually on her finger, though it did not really move. The pattern of vibrations was mixed, a reaction to Sidar and Sidene being channeled outside. For that matter, someone could have been channeling inside. Catswain was sure it should be able to indicate direction, but she could not say how. Ha! For Cadswain and her supposed superior knowledge. She wished she could say that to the woman's face. It was not that Cadswain intimidated her. Certainly not. She stood above Cadswain. Just that she wanted to maintain some degree of harmony. That was the reason she held her tongue around the woman. The rooms she shared with Lan were spacious but also drafty, with no casement fitting its window properly, and over the generations the house had settled enough that the doors had been trimmed so they could close all the way, making more gaps to let every breeze whistle through. The fire on the stone hearth danced as though it were outdoors, crackling and spitting sparks. The carpet, so faded she could no longer really make out the pattern, had more holes burned in it than she could count. The bed with its heavy bedposts and worn canopy was large and sturdy, but the mattress was lumpy. The pillows held more feathers that poked through than they did down, and the blankets seemed almost more darns than original material. But Lan shared the rooms, and that made all the difference. That made them a palace. He stood at one of the windows where he had been since the attack began, staring down now at the work going on outside, or perhaps studying the slaughter yard the manor house grounds had become. He was so still he might have been a statue, a tall man in a well-fitting dark green coat, his shoulders broad enough to make his waist appear slender, with the leather cord of his hadori holding back his shoulder-length hair, black, tinged with white at the temples. A hard-faced man, yet beautiful. In her eyes he was. Let anyone else say what they would. Only they had best not say it in her hearing. Even Cadswain. A ring bearing a flawless sapphire was cold on her right hand. It seemed more likely he was feeling anger than hostility. That ring did have a flaw in her estimation. It was all very well to know someone nearby was feeling angry or hostile, but that did not mean the emotion was directed at you. "It's time for me to go back outside and lend a hand again," she said as she stood. "Not yet," he told her without turning from the window. Ring or no ring, his voice was calm and quite firm. Irene used to say a headache was sign she'd been channeling too much. That's dangerous. Her hand strayed toward her braid before she could snatch it down again, as if he knew more about channeling than she. In some ways, he did. 20 years as Pharaoh's warder had taught him as much as a man could know of Sidon. My headache is completely gone. I'm perfectly all right now. Don't be petulant, my love. There are only a few hours till twilight. Plenty of work will be left tomorrow. His left hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, relaxed, tightened. Only that hand moved. Her lips compressed. Petulant? She smoothed her skirt furiously. She was not petulant. He seldom invoked his right to command in private. Curse those sea folk for ever thinking of such a thing. But when he did, the man was unbending. Of course she could go anyway. He would not try to stop her physically. She was certain of that. Fairly certain. Only she did not intend to violate her marriage vows in the slightest way, even if she did want to kick her beloved husband's shins. Kicking her skirts instead, she went to stand beside him at the window and slip her arm through his. His arm was rock hard, though. His muscles were hard, wonderfully so, but this was the hardness of tension, as though he were straining to lift a great weight. How she wished she had his bond to give her hints of what was troubling him. And she laid hands on Mirel. No, best not to think of that hussy. Greens. They simply could not be trusted with men. Outside, not far from the house, she could see a pair of those black-coated Ashaman, and the sisters bonded to them. She had avoided that whole lot as much as possible. The Ashaman for obvious reasons, the sisters because they supported the Lida. Yet you could not spend time in the same house with people, even a house as large and rambling as Algaran's, and avoid coming to recognize them. Arl Malavin was a Kyrian
Oh,
who
yeah.
seemed even wider than he actually was, because he stood barely chest-high.
Just got
to
done
land.
doing one fire.
Donalo Sandomir, a Kyrian, with a garnet in his left ear, and his gray-streaked beard trimmed to a point and oiled, although she doubted very much that his creased, leathery face belonged to a noble. Malavin had bonded Aisling Noon, a fierce-eyed Greed who peppered her speech with borderland oaths that sometimes made Lan wince.
Let's do
Diana
another
wished she
one.
understood them, but he refused to explain. Sandomir's captive was Ayako Norsoni, a diminutive white with wavy waist-length black hair who was nearly as brown-skinned as a Damani. She seemed shy, a rarity among Aes Sedai. Both women wore their fringed shawls. The captives almost always did, perhaps as gestures of defiance. But then they seemed to get on strangely well with the men. Often Nynaeve had seen them chatting companionably, hardly the behavior of defiant prisoners. And she suspected that Loghain and Gabriella were not the only pair sharing a bed outside wedlock. It was
Turn this
disgraceful. Suddenly fires bloomed below, 6 enveloping dead Trollocs in front of Malavin and Aisling, 7 in front of Sandomir and Ayako, and she squinted against the blinding glare. It was like trying to look at 13 noonday suns blazing in a cloudless sky. They were linked. She could tell from the way the flows of Sidar moved, stiffly, as though they were being forced to rather than guided. Or rather, the men were trying to force them. That never worked with the female half of the power. It was pure fire, and the blazes were ferocious, fiercer than she would have expected from fire alone. But of course they would be using Sidene as well, and who could say what they were adding from that murderous chaos? The little she could recall of being linked with Rand left her with no desire ever again to go near that. In just a few minutes the fires vanished, leaving only low heaps of grayish ash lying on seared earth that looked hard and cracked. That could not do the soil much good. You can't find this very entertaining, Lan. What are you thinking? Idle thoughts, he said, his arm hard as stone beneath her hand. New fires flared outside. Share them with me? She managed to put a hint of question in that. He seemed amused by the nature of their vows, yet he absolutely refused to follow the smallest instruction when they were alone. Requests he granted instantly, well, most of the time.
Got some of that
But the
dab
man
on
would
there.
quietly leave his boots muddy till the mud flaked off, and told him not to track in mud. Unpleasant thoughts, but if you wish. The Myrdral and Trollocs make me think of Tarman Gaiden. Unpleasant thoughts indeed. Still staring out the window, he nodded. There was no expression on his face. Man could teach Aes Sedai about hiding emotions, but a touch of heat entered his voice. It's coming soon, Nynaeve.
There we go.
Yet Althor seems to think he has forever to dance with the Shongshan.
Spread
Shadow
it
Spawn could
somewhat
be moving
evenly.
down through the blight while we stand here. Down through... His mouth snapped shut. Down through Malkir, he'd almost said. Dead Malkir, the murdered land of his birth. She was sure of it. He went on as if he had not paused. They could strike at Shinar, at the whole borderlands, next week or tomorrow. And Althor sits weaving his Shongshan schemes. He should send someone to convince King Esau and the others to return to their duty along the Blight. He should be marshalling all the force he can gather and taking it to the Blight. The last battle will be there, and at Shaiol Ghul. The war is there. Sadness welled up in her, yet she managed to keep it out of her voice. You have to go back, she said quietly. At last he turned his head, frowning down at her. His clear blue eyes were so cold. They held less of death than they had. Of that she was certain, but they were still so cold. My place is with you, heart of my heart, ever and always. She gathered all of her courage and held onto it hard, so hard that she ached. She wanted to speak fast, to get the words out before courage failed, but she forced herself to a steady tone and an even pace. A borderland saying I heard from you once. Death is lighter than a feather, duty heavier than a mountain. My duty lies here, making sure Olivia doesn't kill Rand. But I will take you to the borderlands. Your duty lies there. You want to go to Shinar? You mentioned King Esau and Shinar, and it is close to Malkir. He looked down at her for a long time, but at last he exhaled softly, and the tension left his arm. Are you sure, Nynaeve? If you are, then yes, Shinar. In the Trolloc Wars, the Shadow used Tarwin's Gap to move large numbers of Trollocs, just as it did a few years back when we sought the Eye of the World, but only if you are completely sure. No, she was not sure. She wanted to cry, to scream at him that he was a fool, that his place was with her, not dying alone in a futile private war with the Shadow. Only she could not say any of that. Bond or no bond, she knew he was torn inside, torn between his love of her and his duty, torn and bleeding as surely as if he had been stabbed with a sword. She could not add to his wounds. She could try to make sure he survived, though. Would I make the offer if I wasn't sure? She said dryly, surprised at how calm she sounded. I won't like sending you away, but you have your duty, and I have mine. Wrapping his arms around her, he hugged her to his chest, gently at first, then harder, until she thought he might squeeze all the air from her lungs. She did not care. She hugged him just as fiercely, and had to pry her hands from his broad back when she was done at last. Like she wanted to weep, and knew she must not. As he began packing his saddlebags, she hurriedly changed into a riding dress of yellow-slashed green silk and stout leather shoes, then slipped from the room before he was done. Algarin's library was large, a square, high-ceilinged room lined with shelves. Half a dozen cushioned chairs stood scattered around the floor, and a long table and a tall mat rack completed the furnishings. The stone hearth was cold, and the iron stand lamps unlit, but she channeled briefly to light 3 of them. A hasty search found the maps she needed in the rack's diamond-shaped compartments. They were as old as most of the books, yet the land did not change greatly in 200 or 300 years. When she returned to their rooms, Lan was in the sitting room, saddlebags on his shoulder, Warder's color-shifting cloak hanging down his back. His face was still, a stone mask. She took only time to get her own cloak, blue silk lined with velvet, and they walked in silence, her right hand resting lightly on his left wrist, out to the dimly lit stable where their horses were kept. The air there smelled of hay and horses and horse dung, as it always did in stables. A lean, balding groom with a nose that had been broken more than once sighed when Lan told him they wanted Landarb and Lover's Knot saddled. A gray-haired woman began work on Nynaeve's stout brown mare, while three of the aging men made a job of getting Lan's tall black stallion bridled and out of his stall. "I want a promise from you," Nynaeve said quietly as they waited. Mandarb danced in circles so that the plump fellow trying to lift the saddle onto the stallion's back had to run trying to catch up. "An oath. I mean it, Lan Mandragoran. We aren't alone any longer." "What do you want my oath on?" he asked warily. The balding groom called for two more men to help. "That you'll ride to Falmoran before you enter the Blight, and that if anyone wants to ride with you, you'll let him." Its smile was small and sad. "I've always refused to lead men into the Blight, Nynaeve. There were times men rode with me, but I would not—" "If men have ridden with you before," she cut in, "men can ride with you again. Your oath on it, or I vow I'll let you ride the whole long way to Shinar." The woman was fastening the cinches on Lover's Knot's saddle. The three men were still struggling to get Mandarb's saddle on his back, to keep him from shaking off the saddle blanket. "How far south in Shinar do you mean to leave me?" he asked. When she said nothing, he nodded. "Very well, Nynaeve, if that's what you want. I swear it under the light and by my hope of rebirth and salvation." It was very hard not to sigh with relief. She had managed it, and without lying. She was trying to do as Egwene wanted and behave as though she had already taken the 3 oaths on the oath rod. But it was very hard dealing with a husband if you could not lie, even when it was absolutely necessary. "Kiss me," she told him, adding hastily, "That wasn't an order. I just want to kiss my husband. A goodbye kiss. There would be no time for one later." "In front of everyone?" he said, laughing. "You've always been so shy about that." The woman was nearly done with Lover's Knot, and one of the grooms was holding Mandarb as steady as he could, while the other two hurriedly buckled the cinches. "You're too busy to see anything. Kiss me, or I'll think you're the one who—" His lips on hers shut off words. Her toes curled. Sometime later she was leaning on his broad chest to catch her breath while he stroked her hair. "Perhaps we can have one last night together in Shinar," he murmured softly. "It may be some time before we're together again, and I'll miss having my back clawed." Her face grew hot, and she pushed away from him unsteadily. The grooms were done and staring very pointedly at the straw-covered floor, but they might well be close enough to overhear. "I think not." She was proud that she did not sound breathless. "I don't want to leave Rand alone with Olivia that long." He trusts her, Nynaeve. I don't understand it, but there it is, and that's all that matters. She sniffed, as if any man knew what was good for him. Her stout mare whickered uneasily as they rode among dead trollocs to a patch of ground not far from the stable that she knew well enough to leave a gateway. Mandar, the trained warhorse, reacted not at all to the blood and the stench and the huge corpses. The black stallion seemed as calm as his rider, now that Lan was on his back. She could understand that. Lan had a very calming effect on her, too. Usually. Sometimes he had exactly the opposite effect. She wished they could have one more night together. Her face grew hot again. Dismounting, she drew on Sidar without using the Angreal and wove a gateway just tall enough for her to lead Lover's Knot through onto grassland dotted with thickets of black-spotted beech and trees she did not recognize. The sun was a golden ball, only a little down from its peak, yet the air was decidedly cooler than in Tyr. Cold enough to make her gather her cloak, in fact. Mountains topped with snow and clouds rose to the east and north and south. As soon as Lan was through, she let the weave dissipate and immediately wove another gateway, larger, while she climbed into her saddle and settled the cloak around her again. Lan led Mandarb a few steps westward, staring. Land ended abruptly in what was obviously a cliff, no more than 20 paces from him, and from there ocean stretched to the horizon. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, turning back. This isn't Shinar. It's World End in Saldaea, as far from Shinar as you can get and still be in the Borderlands. I told you I would take you to the Borderlands, Lan, and I have. Remember your oath, my heart, because I surely will. And with that, she dug her heels in the mare's flanks and let the animal bolt through the open gateway. She heard him call her name, but she let the gateway close behind her. She would give him a chance to survive.
Only a few hours past midday, less than half a dozen tables were occupied in the large common room of the Queen's Lance. Most of the well-dressed men and women, with clerks and bodyguards standing attentively behind them, were there to buy or sell ice peppers, which grew well in on the landward side of the Bannekan Mountains, called the Seawall by many in Saldaea. While in Aldragaran had no interest in peppers, the Seawall had other crops and richer. "My final prize," he said, waving a hand over the table. Every finger bore a jeweled ring. Not large stones, but fine. A man who sold gems should advertise. He traded in other things as well: furs, rare woods for cabinet makers, finely made swords and armor, occasionally other things that afforded a good return. But gems brought in the greater part of his profit in any year. "I'll come no lower." The table was covered with a piece of black velvet, the better to show off a good portion of his stock. Emeralds, fire drops, sapphires, and best of all, diamonds. Several of those were large enough to interest a ruler, and none was small. None held a flaw either. He was known throughout the borderlands for his flawless stones. "Accept it, or someone else will." The younger of the two dark-eyed Ilianers across him, a clean-shaven fellow named Pavel Geraneos, opened his mouth angrily, but the older, Georg Damontanus, his gray-streaked beard practically quivering, laid a fat hand on Geraneos' arm and gave him a horrified look. Aldragaran made no effort to conceal his smile, showing a little tooth. He had been only a toddler when the Trollocs swept down into Melkir, and he had no memories of that land at all. He seldom even thought of Melkir. The land was dead and gone, yet he was glad he had let his uncles give him the Hadori. At another table, Mannegan was in a shouting match with a dark Tyrant woman wearing a lace ruff and rather inferior garnets in her ears, the pair of them nearly drowning out the young woman playing the hammered dulcimer on the low platform beside one of the tall stone fireplaces. That lean young man had refused the Hadori, as had Goranellen, who was near Aldragaran's age. Goranellen was bargaining hard with a pair of olive-skinned Altarans, one of whom had a nice ruby in his left ear, and there was sweat on Goranellen's forehead. No one shouted at a man who wore the Hadori and a sword, as Aldragaran did, and they tried to avoid making him sweat. Such men carried a reputation for sudden, unpredictable violence. If he had seldom been forced to use the sword at his hip, it was widely known that he could and would.
"I do accept, Master Aldragaran,"
Damontanus said, giving his companion a sidelong glare. Not noticing, Geraneos bared his teeth in what he probably hoped Aldragaran would take for a smile. Aldragaran let it pass. He was a merchant, after all. A reputation was a fine thing when it enhanced your bargaining power, but only a fool went looking for fights. The Ilianer's clerk, a weedy, graying fellow, and also Ilianer, unlocked their iron-strapped coin box under the watchful eyes of their two bodyguards, bulky men with those odd beards that left the upper lip bare, in leather coats sewn with steel discs. Each carried a sword and stout cudgel at his belt. Aldragaran had a clerk at his own back, a hard-eyed Saldaean, who did not know one end of a sword from the other, but he never used bodyguards. Guards were premises, to be sure, but not bodyguards. That only added its bit to his reputation. And of course, he had no need of them. Once Damontanus had endorsed 2 letters of rights and passed over 3 leather purses packed with gold, Aldragaran counted the coins, but did not bother weighing them. Some of those thick crowns from 10 different lands would be lighter than others, yet he was willing to accept the inevitable loss. The Illianers carefully gathered up the stones, sorting them into wash-leather purses that went into the coin box. He offered them more wine, but the stout man declined politely, and they departed with the bodyguards, carrying the iron-strapped box between them. How they were to protect anything burdened so was beyond him. Kayakun was far from a lawless town, but there were more footpads abroad than usual of late. More footpads, more
Oh, damn.
murderers,
I hope you get over the
more of
cold
every
soon,
sort of
too,
crime,
bro. It sucks
not to
being
mention
sick.
madness of the sort of man just did not want to think of. Still, the gems were the Illianers' concern now. Ruthen had Eldragoran's coin box open. A pair of bearers were waiting outside to carry it, but he sat staring at the letters of rights and the purses. Half again what he had expected to get. Light coins from Altara and Muranby, or no light coins, at least half again. This would be his most profitable year ever. And all due to John Naos letting his anger show. Damantanis had been afraid to bargain further after that. A wonderful thing, reputation. Master Eldragoran, a woman said, leaning on the table. You were pointed out to me as a merchant with a wide correspondence by pigeon. He noticed her jewelry first, of course, a matter of habit. The slim golden belt and long necklace were set with very good rubies, as was one of her bracelets, along with some pale green and blue stones he did not recognize and so dismissed as worthless. The golden bracelet on her left wrist, as an affair, linked to 4 finger rings by chains, and the whole, intricately engraved, held no stones, but the remaining 2 bracelets were set with fine sapphires and more of the green stones. 2 of the rings on her right hand held those green stones, but the other 2 held particularly fine sapphires. Particularly fine. Then he realized she wore a 5th ring on that hand, stuck against one of the rings with a worthless stone.
That's what just happened to me.
Serpent, biting its own
From
tail.
after that dab, it just plugged me all up.
His eyes jerked to her face, and he suffered his second shock. Her face, framed
Either it
by
was
the
that
hood of her
that did it,
cloak,
or
was very
joint
young,
that's
but
doing
she
it,
wore
but-
the ring, and few were foolish enough to do that without the right. He had seen young Aes Sedai before, 2 or 3 times. No, her age did not shock him. But on her forehead, she wore the Kassain, the red dot of a married woman. She did not look Valkyrie. She did not sound Valkyrie. Many younger folk have the accents of Saldaea or Kandor, Arafel or Shinar. He himself sounded of Saldaea, but she did not sound a borderlander at all. Besides, he could not recall the last time he had heard of a Valkyrie girl going to the White Tower. The tower had failed Malkir in need, and the Valkyrie had turned their backs on the tower. Still, he stood hurriedly. With Aes Sedai, courtesy was always wise. Her dark eyes held heat. Yes, courtesy was wise. How may I help you, Aes Sedai?
Yeah, cheers.
You wish me to send a message for you via my pigeons? It would be my pleasure. It was also wise to grant Aes Sedai any favors they asked, and the pigeon was a small favor. A message to each merchant you correspond with. Tarman Gaiden is coming soon. He shrugged uneasily. That has nothing to do with me, I said. I am a merchant. She was asking for a good many pigeons. He corresponded with merchants as far away as Shinar. But I will send your message. He would, too, however many birds it required. Only stone-blind idiots failed to keep promises to Aes Sedai. Besides which, he wanted rid of her and her talk of the last battle. Do you recognize this? She said, fishing a leather cord from the neck of her dress. His breath caught, and he stretched out a hand, brushed a finger across the heavy gold signet ring on the cord, across the crane in flight. How did she come by this? Under the light, how? I recognize it, he told her, his voice suddenly hoarse. My name is Nynaeve de Almira Mandragoran. The message I want sent is this. My husband rides
Number
from
one
World's
down.
End toward Tarwin's Gap. for Tarman Guyton. Will he ride alone? He trembled. He did not know whether he was laughing or crying, perhaps both. She was his wife? I will send you a message, my lady, but it has nothing to do with me. I'm a merchant. Nakir is dead. Dead, I tell you. The heat in her eyes seemed to intensify, and she gripped her long, thick braid with one hand. Lan told me once that Nakir lives so long as one man wears the Hadori in pledge that he will fight the shadow. So long as one woman wears the Kaisan in pledge that she will send her sons to fight the shadow. I wear the Kaisan, Master Eldragoran. My husband wears the Hadori. So do you. Will Lan Mandragoran ride to the last battle alone? He was laughing, shaking with it, and yet he could feel tears rolling down his cheeks. It was madness, complete madness, but he could not help himself. He will not, my lady. I cannot stand surety for anyone else, but I swear to you under the light and by my hope of rebirth and salvation, he will not ride alone. For a moment she studied his face, then nodded once firmly and turned away. He flung out a hand after her. May I offer you wine, my lady? My wife will want to meet you. Alida was Saldaean, but she definitely would want to meet the wife of the uncrowned king. Thank you, Master Eldragoran, but I have several more towns to visit today, and I must be back in Tyr tonight. He blinked at her back as she glided toward the door, gathering her cloak. She had several more towns to visit today, and she had to be back in Tyr tonight. Truly, Aes Sedai were capable of marvels. Silence hung in the common room. They had not been keeping their voices low, and even the girl with the dulcimer had ceased playing her hammers. Everyone was staring at him. Most of the Outlanders had their mouths hanging open. Well, Mannigan, Coronellan, he demanded, do you still remember who you are? Do you remember your blood? Who rides with me for Tarwin's Gap? For a moment he thought neither man would speak, but then Coronellan was on his feet, tears glistening his eyes. The golden crane flies for Tarman Guyton, he said softly. The golden crane flies for Tarman Guyton, Mannigan shouted, leaping up so fast he overturned his chair. Laughing, Eldragoran joined them, all three shouting at the top of their lungs. The golden crane flies for Tarman Guyton! Chapter 21. Within the Stone. The mud of the outer city gave way to paved streets at the walls of Tyr, where the first thing Rand noticed was the absence of guards. Despite the lofty stone ramparts with their towers, the city was less defended than Steading Shangtai, where he and every other human had been gently but firmly refused entrance at first light. Here, the archers' balconies on the towers were empty. The iron-strapped door of the squat gray guardhouse just inside the broad gates stood wide open, and a hard-faced woman in rough woolens, her sleeves shoved up her thin arms, sat there at a wooden tub, scrubbing clothes with a washboard. She appeared to have taken up residence. Two small grubby children, sucking their thumbs, stared wide-eyed past her at him and his companions. At their horses, at least. Tidai Shah was a sight to stare at. A sleek black stallion with a massive chest, a horse that drew attention, yet he had chosen to ride the animal anyway. If the Forsaken could find him as easily as they had at Elgaren's manor house, there was little point to hiding, or at least to putting too much effort into it. He wore black riding gloves to conceal the dragon's heads on his hands and the herons branded into his palms. His coat was dark gray wool without a stitch of embroidery, the stallion's saddlecloth simple, and his sword's hilt and scabbard had been covered in unworked boar hide ever since it came into his possession. Nothing to pull a second glance. Cadswain, in unadorned gray wool, wore the hood of her dark green cloak well up to shield her Aes Sedai face, but Min, Nynaeve, and Olivia had no need for hiding. though Min's flower-embroidered red coat and snug breeches might attract a little notice, not to mention her heeled red boots. He had seen women in Kyrian wearing clothes like that, copying her, yet it seemed unlikely that her fashion had spread to Tyr, where modesty held sway. In public, at least. Nynaeve was wearing yellow-slashed blue silk, and all of her jewelry, just partly concealed by her blue cloak, but Tyr would be full of silks. She had wanted to wear her shawl. That was in her saddlebags, though. A little effort only. The second thing he noticed was the sound, a rhythmic, racketing clatter, accompanied periodically by a piercing whistle. Faint at first, it seemed to be coming closer rapidly. Despite the early hour, the streets he could see from the gates were crowded. Half the people inside appeared to be sea folk, the men bare-chested, the women in bright linen blouses, all wearing long slashes more colorful than those worn by Tyran commoners. Every head appeared to be turned toward that sound. Children darted through the throng, dodging carts, most often pulled by oxen with wide horns, racing toward the noise. Several well-dressed men and women had dismounted from their sedan chairs and stood with their bearers to watch. A fork-bearded merchant with silver chains across the chest of his coat was half out of the window of a red-lacquered coach, shouting at his driver to manage the nervously dancing team while he strained for a better view.
Be right back.
White-winged pigeons, startled from pointed slate rooftops by a particularly sharp whistle, suddenly wheeled into the air, and two large flocks crashed into one another, pelting the folk below with stunned birds. Every single bird fell. A few people actually stopped staring toward the approaching noise and gaped at the sky. A surprising number snatched up fallen birds and wrung their necks, though, and not just barefoot people in worn woolens. A woman in silk and lace, standing beside one of the sedan chairs, quickly gathered half a dozen before gazing toward the noise, with the birds dangling from her hands by their feet. Olivia made a startled sound. "Is that ill luck or good?" she drawled. "It must be ill, unless pigeons here are different." Nynaeve gave her a sour look, but said nothing. She had been very quiet since Land vanished the day before, a subject on which she was doubly silent. "Some of those people are going to die of hunger," Min said sadly. The bond quivered with sorrow. "Every last one I can see something about."
How can I hide?
Bruce Theron laughed.
I am Taviran.
"You're dead," Rand thought of him sharply. People in front of him were going to starve, and he laughed. There was nothing to be done, of course, not when Min spoke, but laughing was another matter. "I am Taviran. Me." What else was happening in Tyr because of his presence? His being Taviran did not always have any effect at all, but when it did, the result could blanket an entire city. Best to get on with what he had come for before the wrong people figured out what things like pigeons flying into one another meant. If the Forsaken were sending armies of Trollocs and Myrddraal after him, it was likely that Dark Friends would take any opportunity to put an arrow through his ribs. Making little effort to hide was not the same as making no effort. "You might as well have brought the Banner of Light and an honor guard of thousands instead of 6, Cadswain murmured dryly, eyeing the maidens who were trying to pretend they had nothing to do with Rand's party while standing in a wide circle around it, chufa covering their heads and veils hanging down their chests. 2 were shy, though, fierce-eyed whenever they looked at him. The maidens' spears were all on their backs, stuck through the harness of their bow cases, but only because Rand had offered to leave them behind and take someone else otherwise. Mandera had insisted on at least a few maidens, staring at him with eyes as hard as emeralds. He had never considered refusing. The only child of a maiden any maiden had ever known, he had obligations to meet. He gathered Tadashar's reins, and abruptly a large wagon full of machinery came into sight, clanking and hissing, wide iron-studded wheels striking sparks from the gray paving stones as it moved along the street as fast as a man could trot. The machinery seemed to sweat steam. A heavy wooden shaft swung up and down, pushing another vertical shaft, and gray wood smoke drifted from a metal chimney. But there was no sign of a horse, just an odd sort of tiller in the front to turn the wheels. One of the three men standing in the wagon pulled a long cord, and steam rushed in a shrill whistle out of a tube atop a huge iron cylinder. If the onlookers stared in awe and maybe covered their ears, the fork-bearded merchant's team was in no such mood. Whinnying wildly, they bolted, scattering people as they ran and nearly pitching the man out on his head. Curses pursued them, and several braying mules that galloped off with their drivers in bouncing carts, sawing at the reins. Even a few oxen began to lumber along more quickly. Min's astonishment filled the bond. Controlling the black with his knees, trained as warhorse, Tidashah responded immediately, though he still snorted. Rand stared in amazement too. It seemed Master Pole actually had made his steam wagon work. "But how did you get the thing to tear?" he asked Pierre. The last he had seen, it had been at the Academy of Kyrian, and seizing up every few paces. "It's called a steam horse, my lord," a barefoot, dirty-faced urchin in a ragged shirt said, bouncing on the pavement. Even the sash holding up his baggy breeches seemed as much holes as cloth. "I've seen it 9 times. Tom here's only seen it 7. "A steam wagon, Donnie," his equally ragged companion put in. "A steam wagon." Neither of them could have been more than 10, and they were gaunt rather than skinny. Their muddy feet, torn shirts, and old breeches meant they came from outside the walls, where the poorest folk lived. Rand had changed a number of laws in Tyr, especially those that weighed down heavily on the poor, but he had been unable to change everything. He had not even known how to begin. Luce Theron began to maunder on about taxes and money-creating jobs, but he might as well have been spilling out words at random for all the sense he made. Rand muted the voice to a buzz, a fly on the other side of a room. 4 of them hitched together, one behind the other, pulled 100 wagons all the way from Kyrian," Donnie went on, ignoring the other boy. "They covered near 100 miles every day, my lord. 100 miles. Khan sighed heavily. "There were 6 of them, Donnie, and they only pulled 50 wagons, but they covered more than 100 miles every day. 120 some days, I heard, and it was one of the steam men said it." Donnie turned to scowl at him, the pair of them balling up fists. "Either way, it's a remarkable achievement," Rand told them quickly, before they could begin trading blows. "Here." Dipping into his coat pocket, he pulled out 2 coins and tossed one toward each boy without looking to see what they were. Gold glittered in the air before the boys eagerly snatched the coins. Exchanging startled glances, they went running out through the gates as fast as they could go, no doubt fearful he would demand the coins back. Their families could live for months on that much gold. Min gazed after them with an expression of misery that the bond echoed even after she shook her head and smoothed her face. What had she seen? Death, probably. Rand felt anger, but no sorrow. How many tens of thousands would die before the last battle was done? How many would be children? He had no room left in him for sorrow. "Very generous," Nynaeve said in a tight voice. "But are we going to stand here all morning?" The steam wagon was moving on out of sight quickly, yet her plump brown mare was still blowing anxiously and tossing her head, and she was having difficulty with the animal, placid as it was by nature. She was far from as good a rider as she thought herself. For that matter, Min's mount, an arch-necked gray mare from Elgaren's stables, danced so that only Min's firm red-glove grip on the reins kept her from running. And Olivia's roan was trying to dance, though the former Damani controlled the animal as easily as Catswain did her bay. Olivia sometimes displayed surprising talents. Damani were expected to ride well. As they rode into the city, Rand took a last glance at the disappearing steam wagon. Remarkable was hardly the word. 100 wagons are only 50. Only. Incredible was more like it. Would merchants start using those things instead of horses? It hardly seemed likely. Merchants were conservative folk, not known for leaping at new ways of doing things. For some reason, Luce Theron began laughing again. Tyr was not beautiful, like Camelin or Tarvalon, and few of its streets could be called particularly broad, but it was large and sprawling, one of the great cities of the world, and, like most great cities, a jumble that had grown up willy-nilly. In those tangled streets, tile-roofed inns and slate-roofed stables, the roof corners slanted sharply, stood alongside palaces with squared white domes and tall balcony-ringed towers that often came to points, the heights of domes and towers gleaming in the early morning sun. Smithies and cutlers, seamstresses and butchers, fishmongers and rug weavers' shops rubbed against marble structures with tall bronze doors behind massive white columns, guild halls and bankers' and merchants' exchanges. At this hour, the streets themselves were still cast in deep shadows, yet they bustled with that storied southern industry. Sedan chairs borne by pairs of lean men wove through the crowds almost as quickly as the children who raced about in play, while coaches and carriages behind teams of 4 or 6 moved as slowly as the carts and wagons, most drawn by large oxen. Porters trudged along, their bundles slung beneath poles carried on 2 men's shoulders, and apprentices carried rolled carpets and boxes of the master's handiwork on their backs. Hawkers cried their wares from trays or hand barrows, pins and ribbons, a few with roasted nuts and meat pies, and tumblers or jugglers or musicians performed at nearly every intersection. You would never have thought the city was the site of a siege. Not everything was peaceful, though. Early morning or not, Rand saw obstreperous drunks being thrown out of inns and taverns, and so many fistfights and men wrestling on the pavement that it seemed one pair was not well out of sight before the next came into view. A good many obvious armsmen mingled in the crowd, swords at their hips and the fat sleeves of their woolen coats striped in various house colors, but even those wearing breastplates and helmets made no move to break up the rows. A fair number of the fights involved armsmen, with each other, with sea folk, with roughly clad fellows who might have been laborers or apprentices, or shoulder thumpers. Soldiers with nothing to do grew bored, and bored soldiers got drunk and fought. He was glad to see the rebels' armsmen bored. The maidens, drifting through the throng and still trying to pretend they had no association with Rand, threw puzzled looks and head-scratching, mainly from dark-faced sea folk, though a gaggle of children trailed after them gaping. The Tyrants, many of whom were not all that much fairer than the sea folk, had seen Aiel before, and if they wondered why they had returned to the city, it appeared they had different business at hand this morning, and more important. No one seemed to give Rand or his other companions a second glance. There were other mounted men and women in the streets, most of them outlanders, here a pale Carianan merchant in a somber coat, there an Arathellan with silver bells fastened to his dark braids, here a copper-skinned Domani, in a barely opaque riding dress, barely hidden by her cloak, followed by a pair of hulking bodyguards in leather coats sewn with steel discs. There a Shinaran with his head shaved, except for a gray topknot, and his belly straining his buttons. You could not move 10 paces in Tyr without seeing outlanders. Tyran commerce had long arms. Which was not to say that he passed through the city without incident. Ahead of him, a running baker's boy tripped and fell, flinging his basket into the air, and when the boy levered himself off the paving stones as Rand rode by, he stopped halfway up with his mouth hanging open, staring at the long loaves, standing on end near the basket, propped together in a rough cone. A fellow in his shirt sleeves, drinking in the second-story window of an inn, overbalanced and toppled toward the street with a shriek that cut off when he landed on his feet not 10 paces from Tidashar, mug still in hand. Rand left him behind wide-eyed and feeling at himself in wonderment. Ripples of altered chance were following Rand through the city, spreading across the city. Not every event would be as harmless as the loaves or as beneficial as the man landing on his feet rather than his head. Those ripples could turn what should be a bruiseless tumble into broken bones or a broken neck. Lifelong feuds could be started by men speaking words they had never thought to hear come from their own lips. Women could decide to poison their husbands over trivial offenses they had tolerated complacently for years. Oh, some fellow might find a rotting sackful of gold buried in his own basement without really knowing why he had decided to dig in the first place. Or a man might ask and gain the hand of a woman he had never before had the courage to approach. But as many would find ruination as found good fortune. Balance, Min had called it. A good to balance every ill. He saw an ill to balance every good. He needed to be done in Tyr and gone as soon as possible. Galloping in those crowded streets was out of the question, but he picked up his pace enough that the maidens had to trot. His destination had been in sight since long before he entered the city, a mass of stone like a barren, sheer-sided hill that stretched from the river Erinon into the city's heart, covering at least 8 or 9 marches, a good square mile or more, and dominating the city's sky. The Stone of Tyr was mankind's oldest stronghold, the oldest structure in the world, made with the one power in the last days of the breaking itself. One solid piece of stone it was, without a single join, though better than 3,000 years of rain and wind have wetted the surface to roughness. The first battlements stood 100 paces above the ground, though there were arrow slits aplenty lower, and stone spouts for showering attackers with boiling oil or molten lead. No besieger could stop the stone from being supplied through its own wall-shielded docks, and it contained forges and manufactories to replace or mend every sort of weapon should its armories fall short. Its highest tower, rearing over the very center of the stone, held the banner of Tyr, half red, half gold, with a slanting line of 3 silver crescents, and so large that it could be made out plainly as it curled in a strong breeze. It had to be strong to move that flag. Lower towers supported smaller versions, but here they alternated with another rippling banner, the ancient symbol of Aes Sedai, black and white on a field of red. The banner of light, the dragon banner, some called it, as if there were not another that bore that name. The High Lord Darlin was flaunting his allegiance, it seemed. That was well. Alana was in there, and whether or not that was well, he would have to learn. He was not as sharply aware of her as before Elaine and Avienda and Min jointly bonded him. He thought he was not. They had pushed her aside to take primacy somehow, and she had told him she could sense little more of him than his presence. Yet she still lay in the back of his head, a bundle of emotions and physical sensations. It seemed a long time since he had been near enough to her to sense those. Once again, the bond with her felt an intrusion, a would-be usurper of his bond to Min and Elaine and Avienda. Alana was weary, as if perhaps she had not been getting enough sleep lately, and frustrated, with strong streaks of anger and sulkiness. Were the negotiations going badly? He would find out soon enough. She would be aware he was in the city, aware he was coming closer, if little more. Min had tried to teach him a trick called masking that supposedly could hide him from the bond, but he had never been able to make it work. Of course, she admitted she had never been able to make it work either. Soon, he found himself on a street that ran directly to the plaza that surrounded the stone on 3 sides, but he had no intention of riding straight there. For one thing, every massive iron-strapped gate would be barred tight. For another, he could see several hundred armsmen at the foot of the street. He expected there would be the same in front of every gate. They hardly gave the impression of men besieging a fortress. They seemed to be lounging about with no order. Many had their helmets off, and their halberds propped against the buildings lining the street, and serving women from nearby taverns and inns circulated among them, selling mugs of ale or wine from trays. Yet it was highly unlikely they would remain complacent about anyone trying to enter the stone. Not that they could stop him, of course. He could sweep aside a few hundred men like so many moths. He had not come to Tyr to kill anyone, though, not unless he had to. So he rode into the stable yard of a tile-roofed inn, 3 stories of dark gray stone with a prosperous look. The sign out front was freshly painted with, of all things, a rough approximation of the creatures encircling his forearms. The artist apparently had decided the thing was inadequate as described, though, because he had added long, sharp teeth and leathery ribbed wings. Wings. They almost looked copied from one of those Shonchan flying beasts. Cadswain looked at the sign and snorted. Nynaeve looked at it and giggled. So did Min. Even after Rand gave the barefoot stable boys silver to curry the horses, they stared at the maidens harder than at the coins, but no harder than the patrons stared in the dragon's beam-ceiling common room. Conversation trailed off when the maidens followed Rand and the others inside, spear points sticking up above their heads and bullhide bucklers in hand. Men and women, most in plain if good quality wool, turned in their low-backed chairs to stare. They seemed to be middling merchants and solid craftsfolk, yet they gaped like villagers seeing a city for the first time. The serving women, in dark high-necked dresses and short white aprons, stopped trotting and goggled over their trays. Even the woman playing a hammered dulcimer between the two stone fireplaces, cold on this fine morning, fell silent. A very dark fellow with tightly curled hair, at a square table beside the door, seemed not to notice the maidens at all. Rand took him for one of the sea folk at first, though he wore a peculiar coat without collar or lapels, once white but now stained and wrinkled. I tell you, I have many of the worms that make silk on a ship, he said haltingly in an odd musical accent. But I must have and berry leaves to feed them. We will be rich. His companion waved a plump, dismissive hand, even while staring at the maidens. Worms, he said absently. Everybody knows silk grows on trees. Walking deeper into the common room, Rand shook his head as the proprietor advanced to meet him. Worms. The tales people could come up with to try prying coin out of somebody. A guard of Sarange at your service, my lord, my ladies, the lean balding man said with a deep bow, sweeping his hands wide. Not all Tyrans were dark by any means, but he was nearly as fair-complected as a Kyrianan. How may I serve? His dark eyes kept drifting to the maidens, and every time they did, he tugged at his long blue coat as though it suddenly felt too tight. You want a room with a good view of the stone, Rand said. It is worms that make silk, friend. A man drove behind him. My eye is on it. At that familiar accent, Rand spun to find Olivia staring, wide-eyed and her face bloodless, at a man in a dark coat who was just passing through the doorway into the street. With an oath, Rand ran to the door, but there were close to a dozen men in dark coats walking away from the inn, any one of whom might have spoken. There was no way to pick out one man of average height and width, seen only from behind. What was a Shonchan doing in Tyr? Scouting for another invasion? He would put paid to that soon enough. But he turned from the door, wishing he could have laid hands on the man. Knowing would be better than having to guess. He asked Olivia whether she had gotten a good look at the fellow, but she shook her head silently. Her face was still pale. She was ferocious when she talked of what she wanted to do to Suldam, yet it seemed just hearing the accents of her native land was enough to shake her. He hoped that did not turn out to be weakness in her. She was going to help him somehow, and he could not afford her to be weak. What do you know of this man who just left? He demanded of Sarange. The one with the slurred way of talking. The innkeeper blinked. Nothing, my lord. I've never seen him before. You want one room, my lord? He ran his eyes over Min and the other women, and his lips moved as if he were counting. If you're thinking of any impropriety, Master Sarange, Nynaeve said indignantly, tugging at the braid hanging from the cowl of her cloak, you had best think twice and again, before I box your ears. Min hissed softly, and one hand drifted toward her other wrist before she checked the motion. Likely she was quick to reach for her knives. What impropriety? Olivia asked in tones of puzzlement. Cadswain snorted. One room, Rand said patiently. Women can always find a reason to be indignant, he thought. rather than Luce Theron. He shrugged in discomfort, and a touch of irritation that he only just managed to keep out of his voice. Your largest with a view of the stone. We don't want it for long. You'll be able to rent it out again for tonight. You may have to keep our horses a day or two, though. A look of relief crept over Solange's narrow face, though patently false rue filled his voice. I regret that my largest room is taken, my lord. In fact, all of my large rooms are taken, but I will be more than happy to escort you up the street to the Three Moons and... Fah! Catswain pushed back her hood enough to reveal her face and some of her golden hair ornaments. She was all cool composure, her gaze implacable. I think you can find a way to make that room available, boy. I think you had better find a way. Pay him well, she added to Rand, ornaments swaying on their chains. That was advice, not an order. Solange took Rand's fat golden crown with alacrity. It was doubtful the entire inn earned much more in a week. But it was Cadswain's ageless face that sent him bounding up the staircase at the back of the common room to return in a handful of minutes and show them to a room on the second floor with dark polished paneling and a rumpled bed wide enough for three, flanked by a pair of windows filled by the stone looming over the rooftops. The previous occupant had been hustled out so quickly that he had left a woolen stocking crumpled at the foot of the bed and a carved horn comb on the washstand in the corner. The innkeeper offered to have their saddlebags brought up, and wine, and seemed surprised when Rand refused, but one glance at Cadswain's face, and he bowed his way out again hurriedly. The room was fairly large, as inn rooms went, yet not compared to most chambers in Elgaren's manor house, much less in a palace, especially not with near a dozen people filling the space. The walls seemed to close in on Rand. His chest suddenly felt tight. Every breath came with difficulty. The bond was suddenly full of sympathy and concern. The box, Luce Theron panted. Have to get out of the box. Keeping his eyes on the windows, being able to see the stone was a necessity, and seeing open air between the dragon and the stone, the open air above loosened his breathing a little. Just a little. Keeping his eyes fixed on the sky above the stone, he ordered everyone to stand against the walls. They obeyed with speed. Well, Cadswain gave him a sharp look before gliding to the wall, and Nynaeve sniffed before flouncing over, but the rest moved quickly. If they thought he wanted space for safety's sake, in a way he did. Having them out of his line of sight made the room seem a little larger. Only a little, yet every inch was a blessed relief. The bond was filled with concern. Must get out, Luce Theron moaned. Have to get out. Stiffening himself against what he knew would come, watchful of any attempt by Luce Theron, Rand seized the male half of the true source, and Sayadine flowed into him. Had the madman tried to seize it first? He had brushed it, certainly, touched it, but it was Rand's. Mountains of flame collapsing in fiery avalanches tried to scour him away. Waves that made ice seem warm tried to crush him in raging seas. He gloried in it, suddenly so alive it seemed he had been sleepwalking before. He could hear the breath of everyone in the room, could see that great banner atop the stone so clearly he almost thought he could make out the weave of the fabric. The double wound in his side throbbed as if trying to rip itself out of his body. But with the power filling him, he could ignore that pain. He thought he could have ignored a sword thrust. Yet with Sayadine came the inevitable violent nausea, the almost overwhelming desire to double over and empty himself of every meal he had ever eaten. His knees trembled with it. He fought that as hard as he fought the power. Sayadine had to be fought ever and always. A man forced Sayadine to his will, or it destroyed him. The face of the man from Shadowloket floated in his head for a moment. He looked furious and near to sinking up. Without any doubt, he was aware of Rand in that moment, and Rand of him. Move a hair in any direction, and they would touch. No more than a hair. What's the matter? Nynaeve demanded, moving close and peering up at him in concern. Your face has gone all gray. She reached for his head, and his skin popped out in goosebumps. He brushed her hands away. I'm all right. Stand clear. She stood there, giving him one of those looks women carried in their belt pouches. This one said she knew he was lying, even if she could not prove it. Did they practice those looks in front of mirrors? Stand clear, Nynaeve. He's all right, Nynaeve, Min said, though her face had a touch of gray about it too, and she had both red-gloved hands pressed to her middle. She knew. Nynaeve sniffed at him, wrinkling her nose in disdain, but she finally moved out of his way. Maybe Lan had had enough and run away. No, not that. Lan would not leave her unless she told him to, and then only for as long as was needful. Wherever he was, Nynaeve knew, and likely had sent him there for reasons of her own. Aes Sedai and their bloody secrets. He channeled, spirit touched with fire, and the familiar vertical silvery slash appeared at the foot of the bed, seemed to rotate into a dim view of massive columns in darkness. Light from the in-room gave all the illumination. The opening, standing inches above the floor, was no larger than the door to the room. Yet as soon as it was fully open, 3 of the maidens, already veiled, darted through, pulling spears free, and Rand's skin pebbled again as Olivia leaped after them. Protecting him was a self-imposed duty, but one she took as seriously as the maidens did. There would be no ambush here, though, no dangers, so he stepped through and down. At the other end, the gateway sat more than a foot above the huge gray slabs of stone that he had not wanted to damage any more than he already had. This was the heart of the stone, and with the power in him, and the light spilling from the gateway from the room in the dragon, he could see the narrow hole in one of those stones where he had driven Kalimdor into the floor. Who draws it out shall follow after. He had thought long and hard before sending Narishma to bring Kalimdor to him. However, the prophecies meant the man was to follow. Narishma was otherwise occupied today. A forest of immense redstone columns surrounded him, stretching up into the dark that hid the unlit golden lamps and the vaulted ceiling and the great dome. His boots echoed hollowly in the vast chamber, and even the whispers of the maidens' soft boots. In this space, the sense of confinement vanished. Min hopped down right behind him, with a throwing knife in either hand, and her head swiveling, eyes searching the darkness. The Cadswain, standing at the edge of the gateway, said, I don't jump unless I absolutely have to, boy. She held out a hand, waiting for him to take it. He handed her down, and she nodded thanks. It could have been meant for thanks. It could have meant you took your bloody time about it, too. A ball of light appeared over her upturned palm. A moment later, Olivia was balancing a globe of light, too. The pair created a pool of brightness that turned the surrounding darkness deeper. Nynaeve required the same courtesy, and had the grace to murmur thanks. She quickly gained her own ball of light. But when he offered a hand to one of the maidens, he thought it was Sarendra, one of the Shido, though all they could see of her face was blue eyes above her black veil. She grunted contemptuously and leaped down, spear in hand, followed by the other 2. He let the gateway close, but held on to Sayadin, despite the worthing in his stomach and head. He did not expect to need to channel again before he left the stone, yet he did not want to give Luthen another opportunity to seize the power either.
You have to trust me, Luthen snarled. If we're going to make it to Tarmangaden so we can die, you have to trust me.
You told me once not to trust anyone, Rand thought, including you. Only madmen trust no one, Luthen whispered. Abruptly, he began to weep.
Oh, why do I have a madman in my head?
Rand pushed the voice away. On striding through the tall arch that led from the heart, he was surprised to find 2 defenders of the stone in ridged helmets and shining breastplates, the puffy sleeves of their black coats striped in black and gold. Swords drawn, they were staring at the archway with expressions that combined confusion with grim resolution. Doubtless, they had been startled to see lights and hear footsteps echoing in a room with only one entrance, an entrance they were guarding. The maidens crouched, spears coming up, spreading out to either side, slowly curling in toward the pair. "By the stone, it's him!" one of the men said, sheathing his sword hurriedly. Stocky, with a puckered scar that began on his forehead and journeyed across the bridge of his nose and down to his jaw, he bowed deeply, hands in steel-backed gauntlets spreading wide. "My lord dragon," he said. "Jargen Handar, my lord. The stone stands. I got this that day." He touched the scar on his face. "An honorable wound, Handar, and a day to remember," Rand told him as the other, leaner man hastily put up his blade and bowed. Only then did the maidens lower their spears, but their faces remained veiled. A day to remember? Trollocs and Murgrol inside the stone. The second time he had truly wielded Kalendor, using the sword that was not a sword as it was meant to be used. The dead lying everywhere. A dead girl he could not make live again. Who could forget such a day? "I know I gave orders for the heart to be guarded while Kalendor was there, but why are you still standing guard?" The two men exchanged puzzled looks. "You gave the order to set guards, my lord dragon," Handar said, "and the defenders obey. But you never said anything about Kalendor except that no one was to approach it unless they had proof they came from you." Suddenly, the stocky man gave a start and bowed again, more deeply still. "Forgive me, my lord, if I seem to question you. I don't mean to. Shall I summon the High Lords to your apartments? Your rooms have been kept in readiness for your return." "No need," Rand told him. "Darlin will be expecting me, and I know where to find him." Handar winced. The other man suddenly found something interesting on the floor to study. "You may require a guide, my lord," Handar said slowly. "The corridors. Sometimes the corridors change." So, the pattern truly was loosening. That meant the Dark One was touching the world more than he had since the War of the Shadow. If it loosened too much before Tarmangaiden, the age lace might unravel. An end to time and reality and creation. Somehow he had to bring about the last battle before that happened. Only he did not dare. Not yet. He assured Handar and the other man that he needed no guide, and the pair of them bowed yet again, apparently accepting the Dragon Reborn could do anything he said he could do. In simple truth, he knew he could locate Alana. He could have pointed straight at her. And she had moved since he first felt her. To find Darlin and inform him that Randall Thor was approaching, he was sure. Min had named her as one he held in his hand, yet Aes Sedai always found a way to play both ends against the middle. They always had schemes of their own, goals of their own. Witness Nynaeve and Varen. Witness any of them. "They hop when you say toad," Cadsuane said coolly, pushing the cowl of her cloak down her back as they walked away from the heart. "That can be bad for you when too many people jump at your word." She had the nerve to say that. Cadsuane bloody Maligran? "I'm fighting a war," he told her harshly. The nausea had his temper on edge. That was part of the reason he was harsh. "The fewer people who obey, the more chance I'll lose, and if I lose, everybody loses. If I could make everybody obey, I would." There were far too many who did not obey as it was, or obeyed in their own way. Why in the life would Min feel pity? Cadsuane nodded. "As I thought," she murmured half to herself. And what was that supposed to mean? The stone had all the trappings of a palace, from silk tapestries and rich runners in the corridors, from Terabon and Eltara and Tyr itself, to golden stands holding mirrored lamps. Chests standing against the stone walls might be for storing what the servants needed for cleaning, yet they were of rare woods, often elaborately carved and always with gilded banding. Niches held bowls and vases of seafolk porcelain, thin as leaves and worth many times their weight in gold. or massive gem-studded figures. A golden leopard with ruby eyes trying to pull down a silver deer with burrow-covered antlers that stood a pace tall. A golden lion that was even taller, with emerald eyes and fire drops for claws. Others set so extravagantly with gems that no metal showed. Servants in black and gold livery bowed or curtsied as Rand climbed through the stone, those who recognized him very deeply indeed. Some eyes widened at the sight of the maidens trailing behind, but their surprise never slowed their curtsies. All the trappings of a palace, yet the stone had been designed for war within
I like that
as
joint
well as
here.
without.
Just a second.
Wherever two corridors crossed, murder holes dotted the ceiling. Between the tapestries, arrow slits pierced the walls high up, angled to cover the corridors in both directions, and no flight of sweeping stairs, but had arrow slits placed so the staircase could be swept by arrows or crossbow bolts. Only one assailant had ever succeeded in forcing a way into the stone, the Aiel, and they had swept over the opposition too quickly for many of those defenses to come into play. But any other enemy that managed to get inside the stone would pay a price in blood for every hallway, except that traveling had changed warfare forever. Traveling and blossoms of fire and so much more. That blood price would still be paid, yet stone walls and high towers could no longer hold back an assault. The Ashaman had made the stone as obsolete as the bronze swords and stone axes men had often been reduced to in the breaking. Mankind's oldest stronghold was now a relic. The bond with Alana led him up and up until he came to tall, polished doors with golden leopards for door handles. She was on the other side. Light, but his stomach wanted to empty itself. Hardening himself, he pulled open one of the doors and went in, leaving the maidens to stand guard. Min and the others followed him in. The sitting room was almost as ornate as his own apartments in the stone. The walls hung with broad silk tapestries, showing scenes of the hunt and battle. The large patterned terracotta carpet on the floor, worth sufficient gold to feed a large village for a year. The black marble fireplace tall enough for a man to walk into, and wide enough to hold 8 abreast. Every piece of furnishing, all massively made, was elaborately carved, crusted with gilt and dotted with gems, as were the tall golden stand lamps, their mirrored flames adding to the light let in by the glass-paned ceiling. A golden bear with ruby eyes and silver claws and teeth, more than a pace high, stood atop a gilded plinth on one side of the room, while an identical plinth held an emerald-eyed, ruby-taloned eagle nearly as tall. Restraint pieces for Tyr. Seated in an armchair, Alana looked up as he walked in and held out a golden goblet for one of the 2 young serving women in black and gold to fill with dark wine from a tall golden pitcher. Slender in a gray riding dress slashed with green, Alana was beautiful enough that Lews Therin began humming to himself. Rand almost thumbed his earlobe before snatching his hand down, suddenly unsure whether that gesture was his or the madman's. She smiled, but darkly, and as her eyes swept across Min and Nynaeve, Olivia and Cadswain, the bond carried her suspicion, not to mention anger and sulkiness. The last 2 heightened for Cadswain. And there was joy as well, mixed in all the rest, when her gaze touched him. Not that it showed in her voice. "Why, who would have expected you, my Lord Dragon?" she murmured, with a hint of asperity in the title. "Quite a surprise, wouldn't you say, my Lord Asteroid?" So she had not warned anyone after all. Interesting. "A very pleasant surprise," an elderly man in a coat with red and blue striped sleeves said as he rose to bow, stroking his oiled beard, trimmed to a point. The High Lord Astral Damara's face was creased, the hair that hung to his shoulders snow white and thinning.
Here,
But
just a
his back
second.
was
We'll
straight
this
and his
one.
dark eyes sharp. "I've been looking forward to this day for some time." He bowed again to Cadswain and after a moment to Nynaeve. "Aes Sedai," he said, very civil for Tyr, where channeling, if not Aes Sedai themselves, had been outlawed. before Rand altered the law. Darlin Cisnera, High Lord and Steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn, in a green silk coat with yellow striped sleeves and gold-worked boots, was less than a head shorter than Rand, with close-cut hair and a pointed beard, a bold nose and blue eyes that were rare in Tyr. Those eyes widened as he turned from a conversation with Caroline Damodred near the fireplace. The Carianan noblewoman gave Rand a jolt, though he had expected to see her here. The litany he used to forge his soul in fire almost started up in his head before he could stop it. Short and slim and pale, with large dark eyes and a small ruby dangling onto her forehead from a golden chain woven into the black hair falling in waves to her shoulders, she was the very image of her cousin Moiraine. Of all things, she wore a long blue coat embroidered in golden scrolls except for the horizontal stripes of red, green, and white that ran from neck to hem over snug green breeches and heeled blue boots. It seemed the fashion had traveled after all. She made a curtsy even so, though it looked odd, that garb. Loose there and hummed even harder, making Rand wish the man had a face so he could hit him. Moiraine was a memory for hardening his soul, not for humming at. "My Lord Dragon," Darlin said, bowing stiffly. He was not a man accustomed to offering the first curtsy.
Lay down.
He gave no bow for Cadsuane, just a sharp look before he seemed to dismiss her presence entirely. She kept him and Caroline as guests for a time in Cairhien. He was unlikely to forget that, or forgive. At his gesture, the two serving women moved quickly to offer wine. As might have been expected, Cadsuane, with her ageless face, received the first goblet, but surprisingly, Nynaeve got the second. The Dragon Reborn was one thing, a woman wearing the Great Serpent Ring something else again, even in Tyr. Throwing her cloak back, Cadsuane retreated to the wall. It was unlike her to be retiring, but then from there she could observe everyone at once. Olivia took a place by the door, doubtless for much the same reason. "I am glad to see you better than when I saw you last," Darlin went on. "You have done me great honor, though I may yet lose my head for it if your Aes Sedai make no more progress than they have." "Don't be sulky, Darlin," Caroline murmured, her throaty voice sounding amused. "Men do sulk, do they not, Min?" For some reason, Min barked a laugh. "What are you doing here?" Rand demanded of the two people he had not expected to see. He took a goblet from one of the serving women while the other hesitated between Min and Olivia. Min won out, perhaps because Olivia's blue dress was plain. Sipping her wine, Min strolled over to Caroline. At a glance from the Carianan woman, Darlin moved away, grinning, and the two women stood with their heads together, whispering. Filled with the power, Rand could catch the occasional word. His name, Darlin's. Wireman Santiago, also a High Lord of Tyr, was not short, and he stood as straight as a sword. Yet there was something of a strutting rooster about him. His gray-streaked beard, trimmed to a point and oiled, practically quivered with pride. "Hail to the Lord of the Morning," he said, bowing, or rather he intoned it. Wireman was a great one for intoning and declaiming. "Why am I here, my Lord Dragon?" He sounded puzzled at the question. "Why, when I heard that Darlin was besieged in the stone, what could I do but come to his aid? Burn my soul, I tried to talk some of the others into accompanying me. We'd have put a quick end to his thunder and that lot, I vow." He clutched a fist to demonstrate how he would have crushed the rebels. But only Anayela had the courage. The Carianan were a complete lot of lily hearts. Caroline paused her talk with Min to give him a look that would have had him hunting for the stab wound, had he noticed it. Astral pursed his lips and commenced a study of his wine. The High Lady Anayela Naransalona also wore a coat and snug breeches with heeled boots, though she had added a white lace ruff, and her green coat was sewn with pearls. A close cap of pearls sat atop her dark hair. A slim, pretty woman, she offered a simpering curtsy and somehow made it seem she wanted to kiss Rand's hand. Courage was not a word he would have applied to her. Nerve, on the other hand. "My lord dragon," she cooed. "I wish we could report complete success, but my master of the horse died fighting the Shongshan, and you left most of my armsmen in Ilion. Still we managed to strike a blow in your name." Success? A blow? Alana's scowl took in Wireman and Aniela both before she twisted back around to face Rand. They landed at the Stone's docks with one ship, but they put most of their armsmen and all the mercenaries they hired in Kyrian ashore from the rest of river, with orders to enter the city and attack the rebels. She made a sound of disgust. The only result was a great many men dead, and our negotiations with the rebels thrown back to the beginning. Aniela's simper took on a sickly twist.
My plan was to sortie from the stone and attack them from both sides, Byron protested. Darlin refused. Refused!
Darlin was not grinning now. He stood with his feet apart and looked a man who wished he had a sword in his hand rather than a goblet. "I told you then, Wireman, if I stripped the stone of defenders, the rebels would still have outnumbered us badly. Too badly. They've hired every sellsword from the Aranan to the Bay of Ramara." Rand took a chair, flinging one arm over the back. The heavy arms had no supports at the front, so his sword was no problem. Caroline and Min seemed to
I'll
have switched
be
their
right
talk
back,
to clothing.
everyone.
At least they were fingering each
Don't
other's
like
toes,
that other
and he heard
joint.
words like backstitch and bias cut, whatever that meant. Alana's gaze drifted between him and Min, and he felt disbelief warring with suspicion along the bond. "I left you two in Kyrian because I wanted you in Kyrian," he said. He trusted neither, but they could cause small harm in Kyrian, or they were outlanders without power. Anger, heated by nausea, entered his voice. "You will make plans to return there as soon as possible. As soon as possible." Aniela's simper grew more sickly, and she cringed slightly. Wireman was made of sterner stuff.
My lord dragon, I will serve you where you command, but I can serve best on my native soil. I know these rebels, know where they can be trusted and where. As soon as possible,
Rand snapped, slamming his fist down on the chair arm hard enough to make the wood creak loudly. "One," Cadswain said, quite clearly and quite incomprehensibly. "I strongly suggest you do as he says, Lord Wireman." Nynaeve eyed Wireman blandly, took a sip of wine. "He has a temper lately, worse than ever, and you don't want it directed at you." Cadswain exhaled a heavy breath. "Stay out of this, girl," she said sharply. Nynaeve glared at her, opened her mouth, then grimaced and closed it again. Gripping her braid, she glided across the carpet to join Min and Caroline. She had gotten very good at gliding. Wireman studied Cadswain for a moment, tilting back his head so he was staring down his nose.
"As the Dragon Reborn commands," he said finally, "so does Wireman Santiago obey. My ship can be ready to sail by tomorrow, I wager. Will that suffice?"
Rand nodded curtly. It would have to answer. He was not about to waste a moment making a gateway to send this pair of fools where they belong today. "There's hunger in the city," he said, eyeing the golden bear. How many days would that much gold feed Tyr? The thought of food made his stomach clench, and waited for a response that was quick in coming, if not from the direction he expected. "Darlin had cattle and sheep herded down to the city," Caroline said with some considerable warmth. Rand was the one getting the dagger look now. "These days," she faltered for a moment, though the heat never left her gaze. "These days, meat is inedible 2 days after slaughter, so we have the animals brought and wagons full of grain. Estanda and her companions seized it all for themselves." Darlin gave her a fond smile, but his voice was apologetic. "I've tried 3 times, but Estanda is greedy, it seems. I saw no point in continuing to supply my enemies, your enemies." Rand nodded. At least the man was not ignoring the situation in the city. There are 2 boys who live outside the walls, Donnie and Com. I don't know any more name than that. About age 10. Once the rebels are settled, and you can leave the stone, I would appreciate it if you found them and kept an eye on them. Min made a sound in her throat, and the bond carried sadness so bleak it almost overwhelmed the burst of love that came with it. So, it must have been death she saw. But she had been wrong about Moraine. Maybe this viewing could be changed by Tavern.
No, Luce Theron growled. Her viewings must not change. We have to die.
Rand ignored him. Darlin appeared puzzled by the request, but he acceded, as what else was he to do when the Dragon Reborn made it? Rand was about to bring up the purpose of his visit when Bera Harkin, another of the Aes Sedai he had sent to Tyr to deal with the rebels, entered the room frowning over her shoulder as if the maidens had made some difficulty for her. They might well have. The Aiel considered the Aes Sedai sworn to him to be Wise One's apprentices, and maidens took every opportunity to remind apprentices that they were not Wise Ones yet. She was a stocky woman with brown hair cut close around a square face, and despite her green silks, lacking Aes Sedai agelessness, she would have looked a farm wife. A farm wife who ruled her house and farm with a firm hand, though, and would tell a king not to track mud into her kitchen. She was Green Aja, after all, with every scrap of Green Aja pride and haughtiness. She frowned at Olivia, too, with all the disdain of Aes Sedai for Wilder, and that faded only to coolness when she caught sight of Rand.
Well, I must say I shouldn't be surprised to see you, considering what's happened this morning, she said.
Unpinning her simple silver cloak brooch, she fastened it to her belt pouch and folded the cloak over her arm. Though it might have been the news that the others are no more than a day west of the Erenid. The others? Rand said quietly and steely hard. Bera did not seem impressed. She went on arranging the folds of her cloak. The other high lords and ladies, of course. Sunaman, Tomaran, all of them. Apparently, they're traveling hot foot for Tyr as fast as their armsmen's horses can move. Rand leaped up so fast that his sword bound for a moment on the chair arm. Only a moment, because the gilded wood, weakened by his earlier blow, split with a loud crack and the arm dropped to the carpet. He never so much as glanced at it. The fools! The Shan at the border with Altara, and they were coming back to Tyr? Doesn't anybody remember how to obey? He thundered. I want messengers sent to them immediately. They're to return to Ilion faster than they left, or I'll have the lot of them hanged. 2, Cadsuane said. What in the life was she counting? A bit of advice, boy. Ask her what happened this morning. I smell good news. Bera gave a little start at realizing Cadsuane was in the room. Eyeing her sideways, and cautiously, she stopped fiddling with her cloak. We've reached agreement, she said, as if the question had been asked. Tadosian and Simon were wavering, as usual, but Cairn was nearly as adamant as Istanda. She shook her head. I think Tadosian and Simon might have come around sooner, but some fellows with strange accents have been promising them gold and men. Sean Chan, Rangiv said. Olivia opened her mouth, then closed it without speaking. They might be, Bera allowed. They keep clear of us and look at us like we were mad dogs that might bite any moment. That sounds like what little I've heard of Sean Chan. In any case, less than an hour gone, Estanda suddenly began asking whether the Lord Dragon would restore her title and lands, and they all collapsed right behind her. The agreement is this. Darlin is accepted as steward in Tyr for the Dragon Reborn. All laws you made remain unchanged, and they pay for feeding the city for 1 year as a fine for rebellion. In return, they receive full restoration. Darlin is crowned king of Tyr, and they swear fealty to him. Marana and Rothella are preparing the documents for signatures and seals. King? Darlin said incredulously. Caroline swayed over to take his arm. Restoration? Rand growled, hurling his goblet aside in a spray of wine. The bond carried caution, a warning from Min, but he was too angry to pay heed. The sickness twisting his insides twisted his rage, too. Blood and bloody ashes, I stripped them of lands and titles for rebelling against me. They can stay commoners and swear fealty to me. 3, Cadswain said, and Rand's skin popped out in goosebumps an instant before something struck him across the bottom like a hard-swung switch. Vera's lips parted in shock, and the cloak slid off her onto the floor. Nynaeve laughed. She smothered it quickly, but she laughed. Don't make me have to keep reminding you about manners, boy, Cadswain went on. Alana told me the terms you offered before she left. Darlin as steward, your laws kept, everything else on the table. And it seems they've been met. You can do as you wish, of course, but another piece of advice. When the terms you offer are accepted, hold to them. Else no one will trust you, Roose Theron said, sounding entirely sane for the moment. Rand glared at Cadswain, fists clenched, on the brink of weaving something that would singe her. He could feel a welt on his bottom, and would feel it more in the saddle. It seemed to pulse, and his anger pulsed with it. She peered back calmly over her wine. Was there a hint of challenge in her gaze? Of daring him to channel? The woman spent every moment in his presence challenging him. The trouble was, her advice was good. He had given Alana those terms. He had expected them to bargain harder, gain more, but they had gotten what he actually asked for. More. He had not thought of fines. It seems your fortunes have risen, King Darlin, he said. One of the serving women curtsied and handed Rand another full goblet of wine. Her face was as calm as any Aes Sedai's. You might have thought men arguing with sisters was a matter of every day with her. All hail King Darlin, Wireman intoned, sounding half strangled, and after a moment, Aniela echoed him, as breathless as if she had run a mile. Once she had talked of herself for a crown and tier. But why would they want me as king? Darlin said, scrubbing a hand through his hair. Or anyone. There have been no kings in the stone since Morina died 1,000 years ago. Or did you demand that, Vera Sedai? Vera straightened from picking up her cloak and began shaking it out. It was their demand would be too strong. Their suggestion. Any of them would have leapt at the chance of a throne, especially Estanda. Aniela made a choking sound. But of course they knew there was no hope of that. This way they can swear to you instead of to the Dragon Reborn, making it slightly less distasteful. And if you are king, Caroline put in, it means that steward in tier for the Lord Dragon becomes a lesser title. She laughed throatily. They may even tack on 3 or 4 more noble-sounding titles to try pushing it down to obscurity. Vera pursed her lips as though she had been about to bring up that very point. And would you marry a king, Caroline? Darlin asked. I'll accept the crown if you will. Though I'll have to have a crown made. Min cleared her throat. I can tell you how it should look if you like. Caroline laughed again and released Darlin's arm, swaying away from him. I will have to see you in it before I could answer that. Have Min's crown made. And if it makes you look pretty, she smiled, then perhaps I will consider it. I wish you both the best, Rand said curtly, but there are more important matters to go into right now. Min gave him a sharp look, disapproval flooding the bond. Nynaeve gave him a sharp look. What was that about? You will accept that crown, darling, and as soon as those documents are signed, I want you to arrest those Seanchan. Then gather every man in Tyr who knows one end of sword or halberd from the other. I'll arrange for Ashaman to take you to Aradaman. And me, my Lord Dragon? Wireman asked avidly. He all but quivered with eagerness, managing to strut while standing still. If there is fighting to be done, I can serve you better there than languishing in Kyrian. Rand studied the man, and Aniela. Wireman was a bungling idiot, and he trusted neither, but he could not see what harm they could do with no more than a handful of followers. Very well, you two may accompany the High Lord, that is, King Darlin. Aniela gulped as though she, for one, would rather return to Kyrian. But what am I supposed to do in Aradaman? Darlin wanted to know. The little I've heard of that land, it's a madhouse. Luce Theron laughed wildly in Rand's head. Tarman Gaiden is coming soon, Rand said. The light sent not too soon. You are going to Aradaman to get ready for Tarman Gaiden.
Chapter 22. To make an anchor weep. Despite the pitching induced by the long blue rollers, Harina din Togara sat very straight alongside her sister, just ahead of their parasol bearers and the steersman of his long tiller. Shallan seemed intent on studying the 12 men and women working the oars, or perhaps she was deep in thought. There was plenty to think on of late, not least this meeting Harina had been summoned to, but she let her thoughts drift blindly, composing herself. Every time the first 12 of the Atha Annier met since she had attained Ilion, she had needed to compose herself before attending. When she reached Tyr and found Zaida's blue gull still anchored in the river, she had been sure the woman was in Camelin yet, or at least trailing far behind her own wake. A painful mistake, that. Though in truth, very little would have been altered had Zaida been weeks behind. Not for Harina, at least. No thoughts of Zaida. The sun stood only a fist above the horizon in the east, and several vessels of the shorebound were making for the long breakwater that guarded Ilion's harbor. One carried 3 masts and the semblance of a high rig, all the major sails square, yet he was squat and ill-handled, wallowing through the low, rolling seas in fountains of spray rather than slicing them. Most were small and low-rigged, their triangular sails nearly all high boomed. Some seemed quick enough, but since the shorebound seldom sailed beyond sight of land and usually anchored at night for fear of shoals, their quickness availed them little. Cargo that required true speed went to Atha Annier ships, at a premium price, to be sure. It was a small portion of what Atha Annier carried, in part because of the price, in part because few things actually required their speed. Besides, cargo hire guaranteed some profit, but when the cargo master traded on his own for the ship, all of the profit went to vessel and clan. As far as the eye could see, to east and west along the coastline, Atha Annier ships lay at anchor, rakers and skimmers, soarers and darters, most surrounded by bumboats so cluttered they looked like drunken shore festivals. Rowed out from the city, the bumboats offered for sale everything from dried fruit to quartered beeves and sheep, from iron nails and iron stock to swords and daggers, from gaudy trinkets of Ilion that might catch a deckhand's eye to gold and gems, though the gold was usually a thin plate that wore off in a few months to show the brass beneath, and the gems colored glass. They brought rats, too, if not for sale. Anchored so long, every ship was plagued by rats now. Rats and spoilage made sure there was always a market for the peddlers. Bumboats also surrounded the massive Shanshan-built vessels, dozens upon dozens of them that had been used in the escape. That was what it was being called now, the Great Escape from Ebu Dar. Say the escape, and no one asked what escape he meant. Great bluff-bowed things they were, twice the beam of a raker and more, some, suitable for battering through heavy seas, perhaps, but strangely rigged, and with odd ribbed sails too stiff for proper setting. Men and women were swarming over those masts and yards now, altering the rigging to something more usable. No one wanted the craft, but the shipyards would require years to replace all of the vessels lost at Ebu Dar, and the expense. Overly beany or not, those ships would see many years of use. No sailmistress had any desire to sink into debt, borrowing from the clan coffers, when most, if not all, of her own gold was being salvaged by the Shanshan in Ebu Dar, not unless she had no other choice. Some, unlucky enough to have neither their own ships nor one of the Shonshans, did have no other choice. Harina's 12 passed the heavy wall of the breakwater, thick with dark slime and long hairy weed that the breakers crashing against the grey stone failed to dislodge, and the broad grey-green harbour of Ilion opened up before her, ringed with deep expanses of marsh, just turning from winter-brown to green in patches where long-legged birds waded. A line of mist drifted across the boat on a gentle breeze, dampening her hair before it passed on up the harbour. Small fishing boats were pulling their nets along the edges of the marsh, a dozen sorts of gull and tern wheeling overhead to steal what they could. The city did not interest her beyond the long stone docks, lined with trading craft, but the harbour. That broad, nearly circular expanse of water was the greatest anchorage known, and filled with shipping and river craft, most waiting their turn at the docks. It truly was filled by hundreds of vessels in every shape and size, and not all of those ships belonged to the shorebound. There were only rakers here, those slender three-masters that could race porpoises, rakers and 3 of the ungainly Shonshan monstrosities. They were the vessels of wave mistresses and of sail mistresses who formed the first 12 of each clan, those that could be fitted into the harbour before there was no more room. Even Ilion's anchorage had its limits, and the Council of 9, not to mention this steward in Ilion for the Dragon Reborn, would have made trouble had the Atha'amir begun crowding their trade. Abruptly, a strong, icy wind came up out of the north. No, it did not come up, it just suddenly was there full strength, whipping the harbour to choppy whitecaps, and carrying a smell of pines and something earthy. She knew little of trees, but much of timbers used in building ships, though she did not think there were many pines anywhere near to Ilion. Then she noticed the mist line. While ships rocked and pitched under that southerly blast, the mist continued its slow drift northward. Keeping her hands on her knees required effort. She wanted very much to wipe the dampness out of her hair. She had thought after Shadar Logoth that nothing ever would shake her again, but she had seen too many oddities of late, oddities that spoke of the world twisting. As abruptly as it had come, the wind was gone. Murmurs rose, the stroke faltered, and the number 4 port oar caught a crab, splashing water into the boat. The crew knew winds did not behave that way. "Steady there," Harina said firmly. "Steady." "Give way together, you shore-bound rag-pickers!" her deck mistress shouted from the bows. Lean and leathery, Jadine had leather lungs as well. "Do I need to call the stroke for you?" The twin insults tightened some faces in anger, others in chagrin, but the oars began moving smoothly again. Shallan was studying the mist now. Asking what she saw, what she thought, would have to wait. Harina was not sure she wanted the answer heard by any of her crew. They had seen enough to have them frightened already. The steersman turned the 12 toward one of the bulky Shonshan ships, where any bumboat that ventured near was being chased away before the peddler could get out 2 words. It was one of the largest of them, with a towering stern castle that had 3 levels. 3! And the thing actually had a pair of balconies across the stern. She would not care to see what a following sea driven by a Samaros or one of the Arith Ocean's Sohins would do to those. Other 12s and a few 8s waited their turn to sidle up to the vessel in the order of precedence of their passengers. Jadine stood up in the bow and bellowed, "Showdine!" Her voice carried well, and the 12 that was approaching the ship circled away. The others continued their waiting. Harina did not stand until the crew had backed oars and drawn them in on the starboard, bringing the 12 to a smooth halt right where Jadine could catch a dangling line and hold the small craft alongside the larger. Shallan sighed. "Courage, sister," Harina told her. "We have survived Shadar Logoth. Though the light helped me, I am unsure what we survived." She barked a laugh. "More than that, we survived Cadswain Malydran, and I doubt anyone else here could do that." Shallan smiled weakly, but at least she smiled. Harina scrambled up the rope ladder as easily as she could have 20 years before, and was piped aboard by the deckmaster, a squat fellow with a fresh scar running under the leather patch that covered where his right eye had been. Many had taken wounds in the escape. Many had died. Even the deck of this ship felt strange beneath her bare feet, the planking laid in an odd pattern. The side was manned properly, however. 12 bare-chested men to her left, 12 women in bright linen blouses to her right, all bowing till they were
Hey,
looking
James
straight down
Money,
at
how
the
you
deck.
doing?
She waited for Shallon and the parasol bearers to join her before starting forward. The vessel's sailmistress and windfinder at the end of the rows bowed less deeply while touching heart lips and forehead. Both wore waist-long white mourning stoles that all but hid their many necklaces, as did she and Shallon. "The welcome of my ship to you, wave mistress," the sailmistress said, sniffing her scent box. "And the grace of the light be upon you until you leave his decks. The others await you in the great cabin." "The grace of the light be upon you also," Harina replied. Touraine, in blue silk trousers and a red silk blouse, was stocky enough to make her windfinder, surreal, look slender rather than average, and she had a gimlet eye and a sour twist to her mouth. But neither those nor the sniffing was meant for discourtesy. Touraine was not that bold. The gaze was the same she gave everyone. Her own vessel lay at the bottom of the harbor at Ebu Dar, and the harbor did stink after the clean air of the open salt. The great cabin ran nearly the whole length of the tall stern castle, a space clear of any furniture save for 13 chairs and a table against the bulkhead that held tall-necked wine pitchers and goblets of yellow porcelain, and 24 women in brocaded silks could not come near filling it. She was the last of the first 12 of the Ata Amnier to arrive, and the reaction to her among the other wave mistresses was what she had come to expect. Lincora and Waline turned their backs very deliberately. Round-faced Niola gave her a scowl, then stalked over to refill her goblet. Lacine, so slender that her bosom seemed immense, shook her head as if wondering at Harina's presence. Others went on chatting as if she were not there. All wore the mourning stoles, of course. Helena strode across the deck to her, the long pink scar down the right side of her square face giving her a dangerous look. Her tightly curled hair was nearly all gray, the honor chain across her left cheek heavy with gold medallions recording her triumphs, including one for her part in the escape. Her wrists and ankles still bore the marks of Shongshan chains, though hidden by her silks now. "I hope you are quite recovered, Harina the Light Willing," she said, tilting her head to one side and clasping her plump, tattooed hands in mock sympathy. "Not still sitting tender, are you? I put a cushion on your chair, just in case." She laughed uproariously, looking to her windfinder, but Kyra gave her a blank look as if she had not heard, then added a faint laugh. Helena frowned. When she laughed at anything, she expected those under her to laugh as well. The stately windfinder had her own worries, however. A daughter missing among the shorebound, abducted by Aes Sedai. There would be repayment for that. One did not need to like Kyra or Polana to know that was necessary. Harina favored the pair with a tight smile and brushed by Polana closely enough that the woman had to step back or have her feet trodden on, scowling as she did. Daughter of the sands, Harina thought sourly. Morale's approach brought a genuine smile, however. The tall, slender woman, her shoulder-length hair as much white as black, had been her friend since they began as deckhands together on an aging raker with an iron-handed sail-mistress embittered by her lack of prospects. Learning that Morale had escaped Ebu Dar and unharmed had been a joy. She favored Polana and Kyra with a frown. Tabrela, her windfinder, also grimaced at the pair, but unlike them, it was not because Morale demanded wrist-licking. Sisters, Tabrela and Kyra shared a deep concern for Talan, Kyra's daughter. Yet beyond that, either would have slit the other's throat for a copper. Or better, in their view, seen her sister reduced to cleaning the bilges. There was no hatred deeper than hatred between siblings. "Don't let those mud ducks peck at you, Harina." Morale's voice was deep for a woman, but melodious. She handed Harina one of the 2 goblets she carried. "You did what you felt you had to do, and the light willing, all will come right." Against her will, Harina's eyes went to the ring bolt set in one of the beams of the overhead. It could have been removed by now. She was sure it remained for the purpose of provoking her. That strange young woman, Min, had been right. Her bargain with the Koramor had been judged deficient, giving away too much and demanding too little in return. In this same cabin with the rest of the first 12 and the new mistress of the ships watching, she had been stripped and hung by her ankles from that ring bolt, stretched tight to another set in the deck, and strapped until she howled her lungs out. The welts and bruises had faded, but the memory lingered however hard she tried to suppress it. Not howls for mercy or respite, though. Never that. Else she would have had no alternative to stepping aside, becoming just a sail mistress again, while someone else was chosen wave mistress of Clan Showdine. Most of the women in this room believed she should have done so anyway after such a punishment, perhaps even Morale. But she had the other part of Min's foretelling to bolster her courage. She would be mistress of the ships one day. In law, the first 12 of the Ata Anmier could choose any sail mistress as mistress of the ships, yet only 5 times in more than 3,000 years had they reached outside their own number. The Aes Sedai said Min's peculiar visions always came true, but she did not intend to gamble. All will come right, Morale, the light women, she said. Eventually. She just had to have the courage to ride out whatever came before. As usual, Zyda arrived without ceremony, striding in, followed by Shylin, her wind-finder, tall and slim and reserved, and Amelia, the bosomy, pale-haired Aes Sedai Zyda had brought back with her from Caneland. Ageless face seemingly permanently surprised, her startling blue eyes very wide, the Aes Sedai was breathing heavily for some reason. Everyone bowed, but Zyda paid the courtesies no heed. In green brocades and white mourning stoles, she was short, with a close cap of graying curls, yet she managed to make herself seem every bit as tall as Shylin. A matter of presence, Serena had to admit. Zyda had that, and the coolness of thought that being caught by a Samaros on a lee shore could not shake. In addition to returning with the first of the Aes Sedai agreed to in the bargain for use of the Bowl of the Winds, she also had returned with her own bargain for land in Andor under Ata Anmier law, and where Harina's bargain had been judged wanting, Zyda's had found great favor. That and the fact that she had come straight to Ilion via one of those peculiar gateways woven by her own wind-finder were not the only reasons that she was now mistress of the ships, but neither had hurt her cause. Harina herself thought this traveling overrated. Shallon could make a gateway now, but making one to the deck of a ship without causing damage, even on still waters like these, especially from the deck of another ship, was chancy at best, and no one could make one large enough to sail a ship through. Very overrated. The man has not arrived yet, Zyda announced, taking the chair with its back to the large stern windows and arranging her long, fringed red sash, just so, adjusting the angle of the emerald-studded dagger thrust through the sash. She was a very particular woman. It was natural enough to want everything in its place on board a ship. Tidiness became a habit as well as a necessity, yet she was exacting even by the usual standards. The remaining chairs, none fastened to the deck in proper fashion, made 2 rows facing each other, and the wave mistresses began taking their seats, each woman's wind-finder standing behind her chair. It appears he intends us to wait on him. Amelia, see that the goblets are all filled. Ah, it seems the woman had put her foot wrong yet again. Amelia jumped, then gathered her bronze-colored skirts to her knees and went racing for the table where the wine pitchers sat. Badly wrong, it appeared. Harina wondered how long Zyda would continue to allow her to wear dresses rather than trousers, which were much more practical shipboard. It would surely be a shock to her when they passed beyond sight of land and blouses were abandoned. Of the brown Aja, Amelia had wanted to study the Ata Anmier, but she was given little time for study. Her purpose was to work, and Zyda saw that she did. She was there to teach the wind-finders all that the Aes Sedai knew. She still dithered over that, But shore-bound instructors, rare as they were, ranked barely a whisker above the deckhands. In the beginning, the woman apparently had believed her dignity fully equal to Zaida's, if not more, and the deckmaster's flail, laid with some frequent regularity across her rump, supposedly was changing her mind, if slowly. Amelia had actually tried to desert 3 times. Strangely, she did not know how to make a gateway, knowledge that carefully was being kept from her, and she should have known she was being watched too closely to bribe her way onto a bumboat. Well, she was unlikely to try again. Reportedly, she'd been told that a fourth attempt would earn a public strapping this time, followed by being hung by her ankles in the rigging. No one would risk that shame, surely. Sail mistresses and even wave mistresses had been reduced to deckhands and gone willingly after that, eager to lose themselves and their disgrace in the mass of men and women hauling lines and handling sail. Removing the cushion from the seat of her chair and dropping it disdainfully on the deck, Irina took her place at the bottom of the left-hand row, Shallon at her back. She was the least senior except for Morale, seated across from her. But then Zaida would have sat only one chair farther up, had she not gained the 6th fat golden earring for each ear, and the chains that connected them. Her lobes might still be sore from the piercings. A pleasant thought. As he makes us wait, perhaps we should make him wait when he finally does appear. With an untouched goblet in hand, she waved away the anxious Aes Sedai, who scurried over to Morale. Foolish woman. Did she not know she should have served the mistress of the ships first, and then followed with the wave mistresses by seniority? Zaida toyed with her piercework scent box, hanging on a very heavy golden chain around her neck. She wore a wide, close-fitting collar of heavy gold links, too, a gift from Elena Vandal. He comes from the Cormor, she said dryly, whom you were supposed to stick to like a barnacle. Her voice never hardened, but every word cut at Irina. This man will be as close as I can come to speaking to the Cormor without dire need, since you agreed he did not have to attend me more than 3 times in any period of 2 years. Because of you, I must accept this man's discourtesy if he turns out to be a scabrous drunkard who must run to the rail and empty his stomach every second sentence. The ambassador I send to the Cormor will be someone who knows how to obey her orders. Alana tittered and smirked. She thought everyone was like herself. Shallon squeezed Irina's shoulder reassuringly, but she did not need it. Stay with the Cornwall? There was no way she could explain to anyone, even Shallon, Cadswain's rude methods of enforcing her will, or her total lack of respect for Irina's dignity. She had been an ambassador from the Apa Anier in name, and forced to dance to any tune the Aes Sedai piped. She was willing to admit, if only to herself, that she'd almost wept with relief when she realized that cursed woman was going to let her leave. Besides, that girl's visions always came true. So the Aes Sedai said, and they could not lie. It was enough. Touraine slipped into the cabin and bowed to Zaida. The Kurumul's emissary has arrived, shipmistress. He stepped out of a gateway on the quarterdeck. That created murmurs among the wind-finders, and Amelia jerked as though she had felt the deckmaster's flail again. I hope he did not damage your deck too badly, Touraine, Zaida said. Irina sipped wine to hide her small smile. Apparently the man was to be made to wait a little, at least. Not at all, shipmistress. Touraine sounded surprised. The gateway opened a good foot above the deck, and he stepped through from one of the city's docks. Yes, Shallon whispered. I can see how to do that. She thought anything to do with the power was wonderful. That must have been a shock, seeing a stone dock above your quarterdeck, Zaida said. Very well. I will see whether the Cormor has sent me a scabrous drunkard. Send him in, Touraine, but do not rush. Amelia, am I to get any wine before nightfall? The Aes Sedai gasped, and making little whimpers as if on the point of tears, rushed to fetch a goblet as Touraine bowed and left. Light. What had Amelia done? Long moments passed, and Zaida had her wine well before a large man with dark hair curling to his broad shoulders entered the cabin. He certainly was not scabrous, nor did he appear drunk. The high collar of his black coat held a silver pin in the shape of a sword on one side, and on the other a red and gold pin shaped like one of the creatures that entwined the Coromore's forearms. A dragon. Yes, that was what it was called. A round pin fastened to his left shoulder showed 3 golden crowns against blue enamel. A sigil, perhaps? Was he a shore-bound noble? Could the Coromore actually have done Zaida honor in sending this man? Knowing Rand al'Thor as she did, she doubted it had been intentional. It was not that he tried to dishonor anyone, yet he cared little for the honors of others. He bowed to Zaida, handling the sword at his side smoothly, but he failed to touch heart and lips and forehead. Still, some shortcomings had to be overlooked with the shorebound. I apologize if I arrived late, ship mistress, he said, but it seemed unnecessary to come before all of your number were here. He must have a very good looking glass to have observed that from the docks. Studying him up and down with a frown, Zaida sipped her wine. You have a name? I am Logain, he said simply. Half the women in the room exhaled sharply, and most of the rest let their jaws drop. More than one slopped wine from her goblet. Not Zaida, and not Harina, but the others. Logain. That was a name known even to the Afa-Mier. May I speak, shipmistress? Amelia asked breathily. She was clutching the porcelain pitcher so hard that Harina feared it might shatter in her hands, but the woman had learned enough sense to say no more until Zaida nodded. Then words spilled from her in a breathless rush. This man was a false dragon. He was gentled for it. How it is he can channel again, I cannot know, but he channels Saidin. Saidin! He is tainted, shipmistress. If you deal with him, you will incur the wrath of the White Tower. I know enough, Zaida cut in. You should be well aware by now how much I fear the wrath of the White Tower. But Zaida held up a single finger, and the Aes Sedai's mouth snapped shut, her lips twisting in a sickly fashion. That one word might lead to her kissing the deckmaster's sister again, and she knew it. What she says is true in part, Logain said calmly. I am an Usherman, but there is no taint any longer. Saidin is clean. The Creator decided to show us mercy, it seems. I have a question for her. Whom do you serve, Aes Sedai? Egwene Al'Vir or Elida Aroyhan? Wisely, Amelia kept her mouth shut. For the next year, she serves me, Logain, Zaida said firmly. The Aes Sedai squeezed her pale eyes shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were even wider than before, impossible as that seemed, and they held a look of horror. Was it possible she had believed Zaida might relent and let her go early? You can confine your questions to me, the shipmistress went on. But first I have 2 for you. Where is the Coromore? I must send an ambassador to him, and he must keep her close in accordance with the bargain. Remind him of that. And what message do you bring from him? A request for some service, I suppose. As to where he is, I cannot say. The man smiled slightly, as if he had made a joke. He smiled. I demand, Zaida began, but he cut her off, provoking angry mutters and hot glares from the other women. The fool seemed to think he was an equal to the mistress of the ships. He wants his whereabouts kept secret for now, shipmistress. The Forsaken have made efforts to kill him. I am willing to take Harina din Togara with me, however. From what I heard, I think he found her acceptable. Harina jerked so hard she spilled wine over the back of her hand, then took another long swallow. But no, Zaida would divorce Amel and marry a ballast stone before she sent Harina din Togara as her ambassador. Still, even the thought of it was enough to make her tongue stick to the roof of her mouth. Even becoming mistress of the ships might be insufficient recompense for being forced to endure cadswain any longer. Studying Logain with a stony face, Zyda told Amelia to pour wine for him. The Aes Sedai flinched, and by the time she reached the table she was trembling so hard the pitcher's spout clattered on the rim of the goblet. Almost as much wine went onto the deck as inside the goblet. Strangely, Logain walked over to her and put his hands on hers to steady her. Was he one of those who could not leave others to do their own work? "You've nothing to fear from me, Amelia Sedai," he told her. "It's been a long time since I ate anyone for breakfast." She stared up at him with her mouth hanging open as though uncertain whether he was making a joke. "And the service he requests?" Zyda said. "Not a request, shipmistress." He had to straighten the pitcher to keep the goblet from overflowing. Taking the goblet, he stepped away from Amelia, but she stood gaping at his back. Like that the woman found no end of ways to get into trouble. "A call on your side of the bargain with the Cormor. Among other things, you promised him ships, and he needs ships to carry food and other supplies to Bandar Eben from Ilion and Tyr." "That can be done," Zyda said, not quite masking her relief, though she shot a frown at Harina. Helena glared as well, of course, but so did Lasine and Neola and several others. Harina suppressed a sigh. Some of the details of the bargain were quite onerous, she had to admit, such as the requirement that the mistress of the ships be prepared to attend him up to 3 times in any 2 years. The Jendai prophecy said the Atha Amir were to serve the Coromor, yet few opinions of how they were to serve included the mistress of the ships going running when he called. But the others had not been there, bargaining with Aes Sedai, convinced that she had no alternative to making whatever bargain she could. Truth of the light, it was a wonder she had gotten as much as she had. "Supplies for more than 1,000,000 people, shipmistress," Logain added as casually as if he were asking for another goblet of wine. "How many more I cannot say, but Bandar Eben itself is starving. The ships must arrive as soon as possible." Shock rippled through the cabin. Harina was not alone in taking a long drink of wine. Even Zyda's eyes widened in amazement. "That might require more rakers than we possess," she said at last, unable to keep the incredulity from her voice. Logain shrugged as though that were of no account. "Even so, that is what he requires of you. Use other ships if you must." Zyda stiffened in her chair. Required. Bargain or no bargain, that was imprudent language to use with her. Touraine slipped into the cabin again, and in breach of all protocol, ran to Zyda, her bare feet slapping the deck. Bending close, she whispered into the shipmistress's ear. Zyda's face slowly took on a look of horror. She half raised her scent box, then shuddered and let it fall to her bosom. "Send her in," she said. "Send her in immediately." "There is news to make an anchor weep," she went on, as Touraine raced from the cabin. "I will let you hear it from she who brought it. You must wait," she added when Logain opened his mouth. "You must wait." He had sufficient sense to hold his peace, but not enough to hide his impatience, stalking to the side of the cabin to stand with his mouth tight and his brows drawn down. The young woman who entered and bowed deeply to Zyda was tall and lean, and she might have been lovely, except that her face was haggard. Her blue linen blouse and green trousers looked as if they'd been worn for days, and she swayed on her feet with weariness. Her honor chain held only a handful of medallions, as befitted her youth, yet Harina could see that no fewer than 3 commended acts of great courage. "I am Sumela Din Salon Long Eyes, shipmistress," she said hoarsely. "Sail mistress of the Darter Wind Racer. I sailed as fast as I could, but I fear it is too late for anything to be done. I stopped at every island between Tremalking and here, but I was always too late." Tears began to trickle down her cheeks, yet she seemed unaware of them. "Tell the first 12 your sad news in your own way, at your own pace," Zyda said gently. "Amelia, give her wine." Not gently said at all. The Aes Sedai leaped to obey. "Almost 3 weeks ago," Samela said, Amayar on Tremalkin began asking the gift of passage to every island, always a man and a woman to each island. Those who asked for Isla Somera requested they be put off in boats out of sight of land when they were told that the Shonshan holds all of Somera. She took a full goblet from Amelia, nodding her thanks, then drank deeply. Harina exchanged questioning glances with Moreo, who shook her head slightly. No Amayar had ever requested the gift of passage in Harina's memory, though for them it truly was a gift, with no gift expected in return. And they avoided the salt, keeping their small fishing boats close to shore. So asking to be put off out of sight of land was as strange as asking passage. But what could be so dire in this? All of the Amayar in the ports left, even those owed money from the shipyards or the rope walks, but no one thought anything of it for 2 or 3 days. The wine had not wet Samela's throat enough to mitigate her hoarseness. She scrubbed at the tears on her cheeks with the back of her hand. Not until we realized none had come back. The governor sent people to the Amayar villages, and they found, she squeezed her eyes shut, the Amayar were all dead or dying. Men, women, her voice broke. Children! Funeral keening rose in the cabin, and Harina was surprised to realize that shrill sound was coming from her mouth, too. Sad enough to make an anchor weep? This should make the heavens sob. No wonder the sail mistress was hoarse. How many hours, how many days had she cried since learning of this catastrophe? How? Polana demanded when the keening died. Face distraught, she leaned forward in her chair. She was holding her scent box to her nose as if the scent could somehow ward off the stench of this news. Some sickness? Speak, woman. Poison, Wade mistress, Samela replied. She struggled to compose herself, but tears still leaked down her face. Everywhere I have been, it was the same. They gave their children a poison that put them into a deep sleep from which they did not waken. It seems there was not enough of that to go around. So many of the adults took slower poison. Some lived long enough to be found and tell the tale. The great hand on Tremalking melted. The hill where it stood reportedly is now a deep hollow. It seems the Amayar had prophecies that spoke of the hand, and when it was destroyed they believed this signaled the end of time, what they called the end of illusion. They believed it was time for them to leave this illusion. She laughed the word bitterly. We call the world. Have none been saved? Zaida asked. None at all? Tears glistened on her cheeks too, but Harina could not fault her on that. Her own cheeks were wet. None, shipmistress. Zaida stood, and tears or no tears, she held the aura of command and her voice was steady. The fastest ships must be sent to every island, even to those of Isla Somera. A way must be found. When the salt first spilled after the breaking, the Amayar asked our protection from brigands and raiders, and we owe them protection still. If we can find only a handful who still live, we still owe it. This is as sad a story as I have ever heard. Loghain's voice sounded too loud as he walked back out in front of Zaida. But your ships are committed to Bandar Eben. If you don't have enough rakers, then you must use your other fast ships too. All of them, if necessary. Are you mad? As well as heartless? Zaida demanded. Fists on her hips and feet apart, she seemed to be standing on a quarterdeck. Her glare stabbed at Loghain. We must mourn. We must save who we can, and mourn for the countless thousands we cannot save. She might as well have smiled for all the effect her glares had on Loghain. As he spoke, it seemed to Harina that the space turned chill and the light dimmed. She was not the only woman to hug herself against that cold. Mourn if you must, he said, but mourn on the march for Tarmangain. Chapter 23. Call to a Sitting.
Oh, yeah. All right, everyone. I'm call it Into This Life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.